I always liked being alone in the woods. I felt calmer when I was far from people, far from the constant noise, far from the things that make my mind feel crowded. I used to think the woods were the only place where nothing could surprise me. Trees were just trees. Dirt was just dirt. Wind was just wind. Nothing extra. Nothing strange. Nothing to make me feel the tightness in my chest that cities gave me. I chose a large forest area that was far from any town, a few hours from where I lived. The place had no campsites, no signs, no marked trails. It was just raw woods, stretching for miles in every direction. Most people avoided that place because it was too big and too easy to get lost in. That was exactly why I went there. I packed heavy, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, tools, extra batteries, extra clothes, everything I thought I would need for at least 5 days. I planned to stay deep inside the forest, go far from the road, find a quiet spot, and just exist there for a while. I reached the edge of the forest early in the morning. The air felt cold in a way that touched the inside of my nose. Everything smelled like pine and soil. I remember that the moment I stepped off the dirt road and walked into the trees, it felt like the whole world behind me disappeared. The ground swallowed the sound of my footsteps. Every direction looked the same. Tall trees, rough bark, thick layers of leaves, broken branches. I kept walking, counting the hours by the sun. I made sure I moved slow, took regular breaks, checked my GPS only a few times so I didn't drain the battery. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing with a patch of flat ground. There was a fallen tree that looked like it had been there for years, covered in moss on one side and dry on the other. The clearing felt calm, almost too calm. But I liked that, so I unpacked my things and set up my tent. The forest had that quiet heaviness that happens before evening, when the animals settle down but the insects wake up. I could hear the soft buzz of small bugs around me, the distant tapping of a woodpecker far to the left, and the wind brushing against the branches above me. When night fell, I sat near my small stove, warming my hands. I didn't light a big fire because I didn't want to draw attention. The darkness in those woods was different. It wasn't the kind of darkness you see near towns or near people. It felt thick. It felt like something you could reach into. The trees around me became taller and heavier looking. I could barely see past the first line of trunks. I ate my food, stored everything properly, and crawled into my tent. The first night was normal. I slept lightly, waking up a few times from random sounds. Cracking branches, small animals moving, wind shifting. Every forest makes noises, and I'd heard all of them before. Nothing felt wrong. When I woke up in the morning, the air felt damp. There was dew all over everything, thick and cold. I boiled water, ate breakfast, stretched my legs, then walked deeper into the forest just to explore. I didn't have any schedule. I just walked, looked at things, listened to the distant running water I could barely hear, and tried to enjoy the peace. But in the afternoon, I saw something that didn't make sense. About 100 feet from my campsite, past a thick cluster of young trees, there was a spot where the ground looked disturbed. It didn't look like an animal digging. It looked more like someone had been kneeling or sitting in the same spot for a long time. The leaves were pushed aside. The dirt was flattened. Some of the soil was still damp in a way that didn't match the rest of the forest floor. I crouched and put my hand near it. It wasn't warm or anything, but it didn't feel old. I didn't think too much of it then. Maybe a hunter had passed through recently. Maybe someone camped there before. The woods weren't crowded, but people still visited sometimes. I didn't want to freak myself out with small things, so I returned to my campsite. That night, things changed. I lay inside my tent, trying to sleep, listening to the usual night sounds. For a while, everything was normal. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard a sound that made every muscle in my body freeze. It was footsteps, not fast, not heavy, but steady and slow. The kind of careful steps someone makes when they don't want to make noise. They came from the woods behind my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer walking around, but the weight was wrong. Too controlled, too even, too slow. It sounded like a person trying to avoid snapping twigs. I stayed completely still. My breathing felt loud inside the tent. I didn't move, didn't unzip anything, didn't reach for my flashlight. I just listened. The footsteps got closer. They circled the clearing. They moved behind my tent, then to the side, then to the other side. It felt like someone was slowly walking around my camp, studying it, testing the ground, watching. I didn't hear any talking. No breathing. Nothing except those slow, careful steps. Then they stopped. The quiet that followed felt worse than the sound. I waited, barely blinking in the darkness. I stayed like that for a long time, maybe half an hour, maybe longer. Then the footsteps started again, moving farther away this time, fading into the trees until I couldn't hear them anymore. I barely slept. When morning came, I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. There were marks in the dirt. Not footprints exactly. The ground was too covered in leaves to show clear prints, but there were disturbed patches. Leaves moved aside, soil showing in places where it shouldn't. I felt something heavy in my stomach, a kind of slow fear that didn't hit all at once but built up like weight on my chest. I walked into the woods in the direction the footsteps had come from, hoping to see nothing. But after only a few minutes, I found another disturbed area similar to the one I'd seen earlier. Flattened leaves, shifted dirt. This one was even fresher. Someone had been watching. Someone had been there long before I heard anything. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be another camper. Maybe someone living off the land. Maybe someone hunting. The forest was big enough that some people lived deep inside it without anyone knowing. But something about it felt wrong. There were no tracks of equipment, no sign of a fire, no sign of a sleeping bag or tarp. Just those places where the ground was pressed down, almost like someone crouched there for hours. I walked back to my camp slowly, thinking about everything. I considered packing up and leaving, but the sun was high, the forest looked normal, and I didn't want to react out of fear. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. The third night was worse. After sunset, the temperature dropped fast. The air felt sharper, like it carried a warning with it. I sat outside my tent longer than usual, staring into the dark, trying to convince myself that the footsteps had been nothing. But the silence felt strange. The insects were quieter. Even the distant sounds of animals felt muted, like the forest was holding its breath. I got inside my tent, zipped it closed, and lay still. I didn't even try to sleep. I waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then, just when my body started to relax, I heard the sound again. Footsteps. But this time they were sharper, closer, more direct. They weren't trying to be silent. They moved through the woods toward my clearing with a slow, steady rhythm. Every step pressed into the ground with purpose. Every step came closer, closer, closer. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it shook my ribs. I felt sweat on my palms even though the air was cold. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of my clearing. Then the sound changed. I heard breathing. Not heavy, not loud, but slow breathing. Someone standing at the tree line, facing my tent. I couldn't see them, but I could feel the presence. The air felt charged in a way that made my skin crawl. The breathing stayed at the edge for minutes that felt like hours. Then it moved. Slowly, carefully. The person walked along the edge of the clearing, not entering it, just circling it the same way as before. I tried to grab my knife without making noise. My fingers shook so much I almost dropped it. I held it tight against my leg, listening as the steps moved closer again. They stopped beside my tent, just inches away. I could hear the faint shift of weight on leaves. I could hear the slow breath of someone standing right next to me. Then I heard a sound that made my entire body lock up. It was the soft drag of fingers sliding across the outside of my tent fabric. Not scratching, just touching, moving slowly along the side, tracing it. I held my breath until my chest burned. The fingers moved along the tent, reaching the front. Then everything stopped. No breathing, no steps, nothing. The silence lasted so long that I started to think the person was still there, frozen in place, waiting. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion, because the next thing I remember was the pale light of dawn coming through the tent fabric. My muscles felt stiff and my mind felt foggy. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked untouched except for fresh, disturbed leaves where someone had stood. I didn't waste any time. I shoved everything into my pack, barely caring about packing it right. I just wanted to get out. My hands shook the whole time. When I finally started walking, I forced myself not to look back. I stayed alert, listening for anything behind me. The forest felt different now. Every sound felt closer. Every rustle made me snap my head around. About half an hour into my hike back to the dirt road, I found something that made my stomach twist. A small pile of ripped leaves placed neatly on a fallen log. I had not seen it before, and it looked fresh. Someone had been ahead of me, watching, maybe following. I started walking faster, almost running at times. My breath came out shaky. My pack bounced on my shoulders. Every few minutes, I looked behind me, expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. The forest seemed endless, and I felt like I was moving too slow no matter how fast I tried to walk. When I finally reached the area where the woods thinned out near the dirt road, I felt the first wave of relief. The sunlight touched the ground more there, and the trees weren't as dense. I hurried forward, ready to burst out of the forest completely. But right at the edge, I froze. There was another disturbed patch of ground. Flattened leaves, pressed dirt, as if someone had stood there all night, watching the road, watching the exit, maybe waiting for me. I pushed past it and walked straight out onto the road without stopping. I didn't look back again. I kept walking until I reached my car. My hands shook so much I dropped my keys twice before finally getting inside. As I drove away, I checked my mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see someone step out of the trees and walk onto the road. But no one came out. No one followed. The forest stayed still behind me. Hashtag, 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 ending. Clear and detailed. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. For months after that trip, I kept waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was standing outside my window. I started double-checking the locks every evening. Sometimes, when the house was completely quiet, I thought I heard footsteps outside on the grass, slow and careful, just like the ones in the woods. I know there was someone out there that night, someone who lived out in those woods or stayed there long enough to know every corner of it. Someone who watched me from the moment I arrived. Someone who walked around my camp, studied me, stood inches away from me while I lay inside my tent. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed one more night or stepped out of the tent when they touched it. I only know that the forest didn't feel peaceful anymore after that. It felt like a place where someone lives in the shadows, moving without sound, waiting for whoever walks too deep into the trees. And I was one of the lucky ones who walked out again. I went into the mountains because I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. I had been dealing with a lot of work stress, and I wanted a place where I could sit alone, breathe, and not hear cars or people. I picked an area that was far from any popular campground. It took me almost 2 hours on a rough forest road just to reach the place where I planned to park. I had researched the area on satellite maps, and I knew there was a small clearing a little walk away from the end of the road. There was no marked trail, no signs, nothing. It was the kind of place where you could spend days without seeing anyone. I packed enough food for 2 days, my tent, a good knife, a small hatchet, and a few tools. I also brought a small first aid kit because I try to be careful in the outdoors. The day was warm, and the sky was clear. The forest had that quiet, heavy feeling that only deep woods get. Everything around me looked untouched. I followed the faint path that looked like it was made by deer. There were old fallen logs, patches of ferns, and small muddy areas where animals had clearly passed through recently. The clearing was even nicer than I expected. It was a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall trees, with a small slope on one side and thick bushes on the other. The grass was short, probably because animals fed there. I could hear a small stream somewhere nearby, maybe a minute's walk from where I stood. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, and the sunlight came through the trees in thin lines. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the trees. I liked the feeling of being tucked into the woods rather than being exposed in the center. I set my backpack inside the tent and sat on a fallen log to rest. The silence felt good. I could hear birds up in the branches, and now and then something small moved through the leaves on the ground. It felt peaceful in the way I had hoped for. After resting, I decided to walk around and explore. I followed the sound of the stream and found it flowing between smooth rocks. The water was clear enough to see the bottom, and I filled my bottle there. When I looked around, I noticed how thick the forest seemed. The trunks were close together, and the shadows between them were darker than they should have been for the time of day. I didn't think much about it then. Forests can look strange when you're alone. I went back to the clearing and gathered some dry wood for later. I had no plans to make a big fire, just a small one for warmth and to cook my food. The hours passed slowly, which was exactly what I wanted. I felt like my mind was finally slowing down. I ate a simple meal when it got dark, and I sat near the small fire. The sounds of the forest at night were steady and calm. Insects buzzed in the grass, and somewhere far away I heard an owl. Nothing felt strange yet. Eventually I put out the fire, cleaned everything up, and went into my tent. The temperature dropped, but my sleeping bag kept me warm. I could hear the wind move through the trees, and the steady sound helped me fall asleep quicker than I expected. I slept deeply until something woke me up a little after midnight. It was a single sound, soft but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. It felt like something stepped on a dry branch just outside my tent. First, I didn't move. I just lay there trying to figure out if the sound was real or something I dreamed. I waited, breathing slowly, listening. The forest was mostly quiet except for the distant stream and a few bugs. Then I heard it again. A slow, careful step. Something large enough to break a stick under its weight. My first thought was that it might be a deer or maybe a black bear. I tried to stay calm. I reached slowly toward my backpack, trying not to make noise. I kept my knife there. My fingers touched it, and just having it near me made me feel a little better. Another step. This one sounded closer, but still soft and slow. I listened hard, trying to compare it to the way animals normally walk. I had spent a lot of time hiking, and I had heard deer many times. They usually move in uneven patterns, stopping and starting. This didn't sound like that. It sounded steady, controlled, almost careful. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. I just stayed still and kept listening. The steps stopped near the front of my tent. I stared at the thin fabric, waiting for its shadow to appear, but there was nothing. Whoever or whatever it was stayed just out of the faint glow of the moonlight coming through the fabric. I waited for a long time. It felt like 10 minutes, but maybe it was only one. Eventually the steps moved again, slow and light, moving away from the tent and toward the trees. I listened until the sound blended with the forest and disappeared. I stayed awake for a long time after that. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a large raccoon, but something about those steps felt wrong. There was no rush, no confusion, no sudden movement. It had moved like something that was trying not to be noticed. I tried to sleep again, but it was hard. Every little sound made me tighten my grip on the knife. My heart beat hard in my chest, and my breathing felt too loud inside the tent. But eventually exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. In the morning, everything felt normal again. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening. I got out of my tent and stretched. I checked the ground around the tent, expecting to see tracks. At first I saw nothing, but then, on the soft patch of dirt near the trees, I saw a footprint. It wasn't an animal print. It was a shoe print. A person had been walking there. The print wasn't very clear, but it was deep enough to show a clear outline. It was longer than my own foot, and it pointed directly toward my campsite. I followed the direction it came from, but the forest floor made it hard to track. Dry leaves hid most prints, and the ground was uneven. After a few minutes, I stopped. I realized I didn't want to wander off too far trying to follow whoever it was. The fact that someone had been walking near my tent in the middle of the night bothered me deeply. I tried to calm myself and think logically. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe it was someone camping somewhere else that I didn't know about. Maybe it was just a person passing through and they didn't notice my tent until they got close. I tried to make myself believe all these things. I made breakfast, drank water from the stream, and tried to focus on enjoying the day. but I kept thinking about that print. I spent most of the afternoon trying to relax. I gathered more firewood, cleaned up the area, and walked along the stream. The forest felt quieter than before, almost too quiet. Sometimes I stopped walking just to listen. I had the constant feeling that something around me was watching, even though I knew it sounded dramatic. Still, the feeling stayed. Later, before sunset, I noticed something strange. On the far side of the clearing, in the grass, there was another footprint. This one was newer. It looked fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time, and it pointed toward the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, not from the direction I had arrived. I stared at it for a long time. My skin felt tight, and a cold feeling spread through my stomach. Someone else had been there during the day. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I didn't know if I should pack up and leave. The sun was already low, and hiking back through the thick forest in the dark didn't feel safe either. The road was far, and getting lost would be worse than staying put. I told myself I would stay one more night, keep the fire going longer, and pay more attention. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking everything, that footprints didn't mean danger, that maybe the person was harmless. Still, I kept checking my surroundings every few minutes. When it got dark, I made a larger fire than before. The flames felt comforting. I kept adding small branches to keep it alive. The night was colder than the previous one, and a faint wind moved through the trees. This time I didn't sit inside the tent right away. I sat on a log with my knife in my hand and my flashlight next to me. I listened carefully to every sound. Hours passed slowly. My body felt stiff, my shoulders tight. Sometime around midnight, the forest suddenly went quiet again. Not slowly, instantly. Insects stopped buzzing. The wind faded. Even the distant sound of the stream seemed muted. It was the same kind of silence that had woken me the night before. I sat very still. I felt the fire's heat on my front and the cold night air on my back. Then I heard the sound. A slow step, not far away, maybe 10 meters from the clearing, just inside the tree line. Then another slow step, and another. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the dark area between the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. The fire made it hard to see beyond the ring of light. My heart beat so hard I felt my chest tighten. The steps stopped. I waited. Then I saw it. A figure standing between the trees. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to recognize the shape of a person. Tall, still, watching, no sound, no movement. The figure didn't walk into the clearing, didn't run away, didn't say anything. It just stood there. I felt my body lock up. I felt more fear than I ever had in my life. My mouth was dry, and my hands shook even though I tried to keep still. After a long time, maybe minutes, maybe longer, the figure stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. No ruse, no panique, just a slow step back, then another, and then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. I didn't go inside the tent at all. I kept the fire burning the whole time, feeding it branch after branch. I didn't even blink for long. Every sound made me turn my head. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. The night crawled by. As soon as the sun came up enough to see the ground, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't rest, didn't even wash my hands in the stream. I stuffed everything in my backpack without caring about the order. When I looked toward the trees before leaving, I saw something that confirmed everything I had been feeling. Footprints. Fresh ones. They circled my clearing. They moved behind my tent. They went close to the stream. They stopped near the place where I had been sitting by the fire. They were everywhere, and all of them were from boots. A person had been walking around my campsite again and again while I was there, probably watching me from different angles, staying far enough to avoid being seen except for the moment they stepped into the open. I didn't waste another second. I walked fast toward the forest road, following my original path. Every sound made me turn around, but I never saw anyone behind me. The forest felt hostile now, like every tree hid something. The walk back took longer than I expected because my body was shaking and my legs felt weak. I kept gripping the knife the entire time until my hand hurt. When I reached my car, I checked the surrounding area carefully before getting in. I locked the doors immediately. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone step out of the trees, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached cell service hours later, I stopped at a small rest area. My hands were still shaking. My breath felt uneven. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand everything that had happened. The ending became clear to me the more I thought about it. Whoever had been in that forest wasn't lost. They weren't another camper. They weren't someone just passing through. They had watched me the entire time, from the first night until the last morning. They walked around my camp while I slept. They stood close enough to look at my tent while I was inside. They came close enough to hear me moving, breathing, shifting in my sleeping bag. They had every chance to speak, to make themselves known, or to leave the area completely. But they didn't. They chose to stay hidden. They chose to watch. They chose to walk around me again and again. And on that second night, when they finally stepped into the open, they didn't rush me or run away. They stood still, as if they wanted me to know they were there, as if they wanted to see how I reacted, as if they wanted to show that they had been in control the entire time. What scared me the most wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. They never approached the fire. They never tried to talk. They never ran. They just watched. A person who behaves like that in the middle of deep woods, far from any road or town, in the middle of the night, is not someone who is camping or hiking or exploring. It is someone who waits, someone who studies, someone who looks for the right moment. And I realized that the only reason I got away safely was because I left early enough, before the next night came. Before whoever it was decided the watching was done and something else should begin. I still don't know who they were. I don't know if they followed me part of the way back. I don't know if they had a camp nearby or if they lived in those woods. I don't know if they were carrying something more dangerous than just their presence. All I know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have walked out of that forest at all. And that thought has stayed with me every day since. I went camping alone in late autumn because I wanted to clear my head after weeks of stress. I picked a remote forest area several hours from home, a place with long dirt roads, small trailheads, and no phone signal for large patches. The random scenario I ended up in was simple at first. I got there late. I set up camp alone. I found signs that someone else had been there recently. And then, over the next day and night, things slowly felt wrong. Nothing supernatural. No strange creatures. Only something human, something real, something that moved with actual weight in the dark, something I could hear but not understand. I arrived at the forest in the late afternoon. The sun was already low. The light was warm at first, brushing the tops of the trees with a golden color that made the forest look safe and calm. I parked my car at a small turnout along a dirt road. It was not an official campground. There were no signs, no markers, no fire rings. Just trees, leaves, old fallen trunks, and the thick smell of cold earth and pine sap. I liked that feeling, that quiet, that isolation. I had done this before many times, so I felt comfortable being alone. I grabbed my backpack, tent, sleeping gear, small cooking setup, and water containers. The air was cool enough that every breath felt sharp in my chest. As I walked deeper into the trees, the sound of my boots crunching the dead leaves echoed through the still forest. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps and the soft hum of insects hiding somewhere in the colder parts of the ground. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, I found a small clearing. Not perfect, but good enough. The ground was mostly flat. There were tall pines creating a wall on one side, and on the other side, the forest opened slightly downhill. I liked that it wasn't too open and not too tight either. Enough space to move around and set my stuff down. I set up my tent slowly, stretching the fabric tight, pushing the stakes into the cold soil. I kept looking around while working, not because I felt afraid yet, but because the forest always made me alert, especially when alone. I could hear the small sounds of the forest settling for the evening. Tiny cracks of branches cooling, the shifting of leaves under small animals I couldn't see, the faint rustling of something high in the trees when a squirrel moved overhead. When my tent was ready, I took a slow breath and looked around again. The sun was falling deeper into the horizon now, casting long shadows across everything. My shadow stretched almost twice my height. The light was fading so fast that it felt like someone was dimming a lamp. I gathered some dry sticks and small pieces of wood for a fire. The cold earth under my boots felt harder now, and the air smelled sharper, like wet dirt and pine mixed with the coming cold. I started a small fire, nothing huge, just something to warm my hands and cook with. The orange flames flickered softly, making the shadows around the clearing dance as if they were moving on their own. I sat on a fallen log and cooked a simple meal, eating slowly, feeling the heat of the fire on my face. Above me, the sky turned from orange to pale blue, then to a flat, colorless gray that soon gave way to darkness. The first strange moment happened when I walked a few meters away to toss some leftover food scraps far from my tent. I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. Not fresh, but not old either. The edges were still clean and sharp. The prints looked like they belonged to boots, heavy ones, maybe work boots or hiking boots. They weren't huge. Not small either. Just normal size. They came from the direction I had walked earlier, but instead of stopping in the clearing like I did, they continued deeper downhill into the darker part of the forest. I told myself it was nothing, just someone who had been here earlier. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker, but something about them felt strange to me even then. They were spaced far apart, like the person walked with long, heavy steps, and the dirt around some of the prints looked scuffed, like the person had stopped and shifted their feet several times. I pushed the thought away and went back to my fire. The night settled fast. The air got cold enough that I could see my breath clearly. The fire crackled softly, and every time it popped, the sudden sound felt louder than it should have. Too loud for a small clearing in the middle of a silent forest. I sat there for a long time, staring into the fire, letting its warmth sink into my body. Eventually, when the sky was fully dark and the forest felt like a huge black wall around me, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside. The sleeping bag was warm, and the ground under me felt cold but bearable. I lay there listening to the forest. At first, I heard the usual things. Small animals moving through leaves, the occasional creak of a tree shifting its weight in the windless night. But then, much later, when I was half asleep, I heard something that made my whole body tense up. A slow, heavy step. Not fast, not running, just a single step, far away but not far enough. Then another step. Then the sound stopped. I stayed still, breathing shallowly. I wasn't sure if it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something heavier, but the sound had a rhythm to it, a human rhythm. Slow steps, weight shifting, leaves crunching under a boot or shoe. I waited for a long time. The air inside the tent felt tight. My sleeping bag felt too warm now. I kept listening, trying to decide if I should sit up or stay still. But the sound didn't come back. Not another step. Not even a small noise from the same direction. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into sleep. When I woke up in the morning, the sky was a pale gray with weak sunlight pushing through the trees. Everything felt cold and damp. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, stretching my stiff legs. The fire was dead, only black ash and a few small pieces of charcoal sitting in the center. I walked around the clearing slowly, checking for anything unusual even though I didn't expect to find anything. But then I saw it. A footprint. A new one, right near the edge of the clearing. A full, deep boot print in the soft dirt, deeper than mine. The tread pattern was different from my boots. The shape was different, and it had not been there yesterday. Pointed toward the trees, not toward my tent, not toward the fire, just toward the forest, as if someone had stepped close to the clearing, looked around, and then walked away. My stomach tightened. I felt a cold pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. This wasn't my imagination. Someone had been near my camp while I slept. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a hunter checking the area early in the morning. Maybe someone had walked by and left without noticing my tent. But the print looked deliberate, clean, heavy, like the person had stood there for a moment before moving on. I took a long breath and made myself continue with my morning routine. I boiled water for coffee, forced myself to eat something even though I didn't feel hungry, and tried to think logically. The forest was public land. Anyone could walk through it. I was not the only person who used these trails, but something felt off. It was the silence. The heavy kind of silence that feels intentional, like the whole forest is listening. I decided to stay one more night anyway, because leaving early felt like running away without knowing from what. I told myself I would explore a bit further during the day, stay aware, and pack up early the following morning. Around noon, I decided to walk downhill, toward the direction of the old footprints I saw yesterday. The forest there was darker. The trees were closer together, and the ground was covered with thick, damp leaves that muffled every step. The air smelled like wet bark and rotten wood. As I moved deeper, I kept hearing faint noises behind me. A soft crunch, a small twig breaking. But each time I stopped to listen, everything went silent again. I couldn't tell if it was just the forest or something following far away. I found nothing unusual for a long time. Just more trees, fallen logs, cold patches of mud, and the quiet hum of the forest. But then I found something strange. A small clearing, not like the one where I camped. This one had a single tree stump in the center, cut cleanly with a saw. Next to it were old pieces of rope, a crushed metal can, and a broken folding chair half buried in dirt. It looked abandoned. It also looked like someone had been trying to use it as a makeshift camp a long time ago. The rope was frayed. The can was rusted. The chair's fabric was torn completely, but the dirt around the stump had fresh marks. Someone had stepped there recently. I could see them clearly, boot prints, the same pattern as the one near my camp. They circled the stump, stopped, circled again, then disappeared into the darker trees beyond. I didn't follow them. Something in my stomach told me not to. The walk back felt longer. Every sound felt louder. Every shift of wind made the trees creak in a way that sounded too much like footsteps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, watching, but there was nothing. When I reached my camp again, the sun was already lowering behind the trees, turning the sky a dim orange. I added more wood to my fire and sat close to it, feeling the heat soak into my hands. The forest felt colder tonight, heavier, like something in it had changed. I didn't sleep early. I stayed awake, listening. When the fire burned low, I let it die on purpose. I didn't want the light to make me feel exposed. I wanted to sit in the dark and hear everything clearly. Hours passed. The forest settled. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. I could see the vague shapes of trees, bushes, and the outline of my tent. My breath made soft white clouds in front of my face. Then I heard it again. A step. Slow. Heavy. Not close, but not far. Then another step. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The steps came again, but from a different direction. Still slow. Still heavy. The sound of a boot sinking into soft leaves, pressing down, lifting up. Then another sound. Not footsteps this time. A soft scrape, like someone dragging something. A piece of fabric, a sleeve, maybe even a backpack, against the rough bark of a tree. My heartbeat began to pound so hard I felt it in my throat. I thought of calling out, but I remembered I had promised myself to stay silent. Speaking into the darkness felt too dangerous, too risky, too open. The sounds stopped. Everything went still. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint ringing in my ears. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Couldn't tell. The cold night air made my fingers numb, but I didn't move them. I stayed still, staring into the dark forest, expecting something to move. Eventually, I forced myself into my tent, though every instinct told me not to. I lay in my sleeping bag with my ears wide open. My body felt stiff, like I was frozen in place. My breathing stayed shallow. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard the worst sound so far. A branch snapped. Loud, sharp, close. Not an animal. Not a small twig. Thick branch. The kind that breaks only under serious weight. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Slow, heavy breathing. coming from outside the tent, maybe 10 meters away, maybe less. The breathing stopped. Then everything went silent again. I didn't sleep at all after that. When the sky finally started to lighten, I crawled out of the tent with shaking hands. The cold morning air hit my face like ice. I looked around, scanning for footprints, broken branches, anything. And I found them. Fresh prints, circling my camp. They weren't running prints. They weren't sneaking prints. They were slow, steady steps, circling around my clearing at least twice. They came from the direction of the dark forest, walked behind my tent, around my fire pit, and then back toward the trees again. I felt my stomach twist. My throat tightened. My chest felt hollow and cold. Someone had been there while I was awake. Someone had walked around me in the dark. Someone had stood close enough to hear me breathe. And they left nothing behind but footprints that felt too deliberate. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, rolling everything tightly, shoving it into my backpack without caring if it fit neatly. The whole time, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone watching from behind the thick trunks. I walked fast toward the way back to my car, my boots crunching through the leaves. Every sound behind me made my heart jump. A small rustle made me stop and listen. A faint crack made me speed up. The forest felt like it was closing in around me, like the trees were thicker, the air colder, the silence heavier. As I walked, I saw more prints. Fresh ones. Not mine. They followed the same direction I was walking. Sometimes they were beside the path. Sometimes they crossed it. Sometimes they disappeared into the trees only to appear again farther down. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as my legs allowed. My throat stayed tight. My mind stayed focused on the road ahead. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look around. I unlocked the door, threw my backpack inside, and sat in the driver's seat with my hands shaking. Before starting the car, I glanced once toward the trees. There was no one there, but the forest looked darker than before. Still, silent, like something was waiting just beyond the first row of trees. I started the engine and drove away, the dirt road kicking dust behind me. My hands didn't stop shaking until I reached the highway, miles away from the forest. Only then did I finally feel the tightness in my chest loosen, but only a little. When I got home, I cleaned my gear and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone who lived off-grid. Maybe they were curious and didn't mean any harm. But the memory that stuck with me the most was not the footprints, not the heavy breathing, not the snapping branch. It was the circle, the perfect, slow circle someone walked around my camp in the middle of the night. A circle that showed they were not lost, not passing through, not stumbling in the dark. They were watching, they were studying, and they walked away only when they wanted to. I haven't gone camping alone since then. And the truth is, I don't think I ever will again. Because the ending to that trip was clear and real. Nothing supernatural followed me. Nothing magical chased me. Nothing impossible happened. The danger was simple, human, and completely real. Someone else was out there in the forest with me. Someone who moved quietly, waited patiently, and stood close enough in the darkness that I could hear their breathing. Someone who didn't need to say a single word to make it clear I had not been alone. And I know deep down that if I had stayed one more night, or walked a little deeper, or ignored the prints one more time, my story would not have ended in my car, driving away under the pale morning sky. It would have ended in that forest, and no one would have ever known where to find me. I reached the campsite late in the afternoon, much later than I had planned. The sky had that heavy gray look that made it feel like the light was fading faster than it should. The air felt cool and thick, the kind that sticks to your skin and tells you the temperature would drop sharply at night. I walked slowly across the uneven ground, listening to the crunch of old leaves under my boots and trying to find a flat place to set up my small tent. The whole area was quiet in a way that felt too heavy, almost like the woods were watching me. I had been camping alone before, so I knew the usual noises and textures of the wild, but something about the silence around this place felt different, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I picked a spot beside a group of tall trees with thin trunks. Their branches were twisted because of the wind that probably hit this place often. I placed my backpack down, stretched my back, and felt the ache from the hike. It had been a long walk from the trailhead, and the weight of the pack had dug into my shoulders. The straps left marks on my shirt that I could feel when I moved. I took out the tent and started setting it up slowly, taking my time because I wanted everything to be perfect before the sun went down. As I pushed the stakes into the ground, I noticed how soft the soil felt. It wasn't like the usual packed dirt of most campsites. It had a loose, disturbed feeling, like it had been dug up recently. I pressed my hand flat on the surface and felt how the soil shifted under even slight pressure. It didn't feel normal, but I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself that maybe this area had a lot of small animals moving around, or maybe it rained recently and loosened the dirt. When the tent was finally up, I took out my small camping stove and the metal cup I used for boiling water. I pulled out a packet of instant noodles and held it in my hand for a second while looking around the area. The woods were dense on every side except the narrow path I had walked through. The path bent out of sight only after a few meters, swallowed by tall trees and thick bushes. The branches were covered with old moss, and there were patches of bright green lichen that stood out against the darker bark. Everything smelled damp and old. It felt like a place that didn't want people staying in it. While waiting for the water to heat, I walked a few steps away from the tent and looked around more carefully. I saw something strange on the ground about 10 steps away. It looked like an old piece of rope sticking out from the dirt. When I moved closer, I noticed it wasn't rope but a torn strap from a backpack. It was dirty, half-buried, and looked like it had been there for a long time. I crouched down and pulled gently, but the ground held it tight, and I didn't want to dig deeper. Something about seeing part of someone else's gear here made my stomach feel tight. It made me wonder if someone camped here before and left in a hurry or never came back to get their things. I walked away from it and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. The water started boiling, and I poured it into the cup, letting the noodles soften. I ate slowly, standing up the entire time because I didn't feel comfortable enough to sit down. The whole area felt like it had too many shadows even though the sun had not completely set yet. The trees blocked most of the light, letting only narrow streaks pass through. It made the whole place look darker than it should be. When I finished eating, I packed everything back carefully. I hated leaving food scraps around since they could attract animals. I stored the trash inside a sealed bag and placed it inside my backpack. Then I took a slow walk around the immediate area, wanting to understand the sound pattern of the forest before darkness settled in. When camping alone, I always paid attention to the noises because silence was usually worse than sound. If I could hear leaves, wind, or small animals, it meant things were normal. But this place didn't have any of that. The silence pressed down on everything, making even my own footsteps sound too loud. The sun finally dipped behind the distant ridge, leaving only a faint gray light behind it. The air cooled so quickly that I could see my breath for a moment. I stepped back to my campsite and zipped open the tent just enough to crawl inside. I sat down on my sleeping mat and pulled out my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away because I wanted my eyes to adjust to the darkness outside first. Everything felt heavier in the dim light. The shapes of trees turned into tall, thin silhouettes that almost blended into the darkness. The ground still bothered me. The soft, disturbed soil under the tent felt strange each time I shifted my weight. I laid down and tried to ignore it, pulling the sleeping bag over my chest. For a few minutes, I stayed completely still, listening to the outside world. The silence didn't break. It actually felt like it deepened, like the forest held its breath even more now that night had fallen. A couple of hours must have passed because the air inside the tent felt colder, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves high above the tent. That was the first natural sound I had heard all evening. But soon after that, I heard something else. It was soft, almost too soft to notice, but the sound repeated just enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. It was the sound of something pressing lightly on the ground nearby. It wasn't the steps of a small animal. It was too slow and too heavy for that. It reminded me of the slow, careful steps of something trying not to be noticed. I stayed completely still. My heartbeat suddenly felt stronger, and each breath made a faint sound inside the sleeping bag. I tried to breathe slower to make less noise, but the more I focused on it, the louder it felt. The sound outside came again, this time a little closer. It had a pattern to it, a slow shifting weight on soft soil. I pictured something, maybe a large animal, walking around the tent with cautious steps. But the steps didn't continue in a straight line. They circled. That was what frightened me more than anything. The sound moved slowly around the tent, not wandering like an animal passing through, but circling, pausing, then circling again. My hands felt cold even though they were inside the sleeping bag. I kept my eyes open even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The tent walls blocked all outside details, leaving only the faint outline of branches above when the moonlight hit the fabric. Each time the steps circled the tent, the soft soil shifted with a low sound that I could feel more than hear. It reminded me of someone walking on loose sand. I stayed awake, completely frozen, for what felt like hours. The steps eventually stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse. The air felt different outside, as if something was still out there, waiting or watching. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it could have been a deer or something else, but the circling pattern didn't match the movement of any animal I knew. Animals moved with more confidence, more unpredictability. This movement was too slow, too controlled, too focused. When exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut, it didn't come with comfort. I fell into light, broken sleep, waking up every few minutes to check if I could hear anything. Each time I woke up, the silence stayed heavy. At some point, I must have stayed asleep longer because when I opened my eyes again, I could see a faint blue light outside the tent, the early morning sky. For a moment, relief washed over me. The night had passed, but when I unzipped the tent and crawled out, that relief died almost immediately. Around the tent, the soft soil showed very clear marks. They weren't animal prints. They were long, deep impressions of someone's boots. They circled the tent exactly the way I had heard in the night. The prints were fresh, pressed deeply into the soft dirt. I followed them slowly with my eyes, careful not to disturb them. They formed a perfect loop around the tent, actually several loops, overlapping each other. Whoever made them had walked around the tent multiple times during the night. My stomach tightened. I stepped back, my breathing growing faster. The prints were not old. They were clean and sharp around the edges. They were made only hours ago, when I was inside the tent trying not to breathe too loudly. I followed the prints a short distance away from the tent. They continued for a few meters toward the thick group of trees but suddenly stopped. The last print ended right before the dense undergrowth, and after that, there were no marks, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. It looked like whoever stood there either knew how to leave no tracks or had simply stood still for a long time before stepping away lightly. The strap I saw the day before, the torn backpack strap, came back into my memory. I walked over to it again. This time I knelt down and brushed aside more soil. Under the strap, I found a bent metal piece that looked like a broken piece of a belt buckle. It wasn't rusted. It looked too new to be something abandoned long ago. The air around me felt colder even though the sun was rising. The trees cast long shadows that stretched around the campsite. For a long moment, I just stood still, trying to understand everything. After seeing the footprints, the truth felt clear. Someone had been watching me all night. Someone who moved around quietly, slowly, circling the tent, stepping carefully on the soft ground. I packed my things faster than I had ever packed before. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag inside the pack. The tent took longer because the stakes were deep in the soft soil, but I pulled them out roughly, not caring if I bent them. Every sound I made felt too loud, like it would attract attention. The woods around me felt different now, almost hostile. Each shadow looked deeper, and each branch looked like it hid something behind it. As I slung the backpack onto my shoulders, I noticed something else. Near the base of one of the trees, half covered by old leaves, was a small piece of cloth. When I picked it up, I realized it was a torn piece of someone's shirt. The edges were frayed in a way that looked like it had been ripped by force. The fabric felt cold and slightly damp. I dropped it quickly and wiped my hand on my pants, feeling a wave of unease crawl up my spine. I started walking toward the path I came from. Every few steps, I checked behind me, expecting to see movement. The forest felt wrong in the daylight, like the shadows were still hiding whatever watched me. Each sound I made echoed slightly, not because it was loud, but because the woods remained too silent. Even as I moved farther from the campsite, nothing made noise. No birds, no small animals, not even the wind. The path bent the same way I remembered, but the bushes looked different, almost like someone had pushed through them recently. Branches were bent at strange angles, and the ground looked pressed down in a narrow trail that wasn't there before. I avoided that disturbed path and stuck to the one I recognized. The trail felt longer than it had the day before. Each minute felt heavy with the fear that the footprints around my tent had planted in me. After what felt like an hour of walking, I reached a point where the woods became less dense. The air felt clearer, and I could finally hear a faint sound of wind moving through the trees. That sound alone brought some comfort. For the first time since the previous night, the forest sounded alive again. I kept a steady pace, pushing myself to move faster even though my legs felt heavy. When I finally saw the trailhead sign in the distance, my chest loosened slightly. I walked straight to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and threw my backpack inside. Before starting the engine, I looked back one last time at the trail that led into the woods. The entrance looked quiet and harmless, but after what happened, I knew better. The ending became clear to me as I sat there catching my breath. There was no ghost, no creature, nothing supernatural. Someone had been out there. Someone silent, patient, and comfortable moving through the woods in complete darkness. Someone who had circled my tent several times without making a sound loud enough to alert me. Someone who left fresh footprints but no trail after the last step near the trees. Someone who didn't approach me but watched me closely from only a few steps away. I drove away from that place with a heavy feeling sitting deep inside my chest. Even now, the image of those clear footprints circling my tent stays in my mind. The soft soil, the ripped strap, the torn cloth, the silence, the circling steps. All of it formed a simple, clear truth that I carry with me. I wasn't alone that night, and the person who walked around my tent wasn't lost, wasn't confused, and wasn't curious. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were watching me, and they didn't want to be seen. I went camping alone deep in the northern woods because I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. I had spent too many days stuck inside, feeling like my life had turned into a cycle of repeating the same movements and staring at the same screens. I wanted open space, clean air, long trails, and the feeling of being away from human noise. So I picked a forest area that people rarely talked about. It was a large spread of wilderness with small rivers, thick pine trees, and uneven ground that stretched far without any clear end. Most people preferred the more open camping sites with built-in fire rings and nearby parking areas, but I wanted the opposite. I wanted something remote where I could walk for hours without seeing anyone. The weather was cool but not cold, and the sky was covered with light gray clouds that moved slowly. The air felt heavy in a calming way, almost like the forest itself was asking me to walk slower and pay attention to the ground, the trees, the sound of my steps on the dry brown needles. I carried a heavy backpack with enough food, clothes, and gear for 2 nights. I had planned to hike into the woods, find a comfortable spot by one of the small streams, and set up my tent there. I began the hike early in the day. The trail started wide and easy and then became narrow and twisted. The deeper I walked, the more I felt that strange, satisfying separation from everything else. The sounds of cars faded completely. Birds became the main soundtrack along with the wind brushing against branches. At one point, I stopped just to take a slow breath and enjoy that silence. My legs felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that made me feel like I was actually doing something with my body and not just sitting all day. As I continued moving deeper, I noticed the forest grew thicker. The trees stood closer together, and the ground became uneven with fallen logs and loose rocks. There were no official marks or signs anymore, but I didn't worry because I had my GPS device and map. My plan was to camp by a stream I saw on the map that cut across a long valley deeper into the forest. The valley was narrow, and the stream made a soft bend that created a small open area, which looked perfect for a tent. The hike took longer than I expected. By the time I reached the valley, the sky had shifted to a darker shade of gray, and the air felt colder. The stream was moving fast, carrying clear water that reflected the dim light. I crossed a small section by stepping over some large stones, and on the other side I saw a flat patch of ground just large enough for a tent. The place felt isolated, quiet, and undisturbed, exactly what I wanted. I dropped my backpack and started setting up my tent. The ground was soft but not muddy. The smell of wet plants filled the air. I cleared away some stones and small branches before anchoring the tent tightly. After that, I gathered dry sticks and built a small fire to warm up the area. The flames flickered gently, and soon I felt a comfortable warmth spreading over me. It made the area feel safer, even though I had no real reason to feel unsafe yet. I ate some food, drank water, and sat by the fire watching the trees sway slowly. There was something peaceful about the way the forest moved when there was no human voice mixing with it. Everything felt slow and natural. I wondered why I didn't do this more often. The idea of sleeping out there alone didn't worry me. I had camped alone before and never had any trouble. As the daylight dropped, the forest became darker in a gradual way. First, the light softened and muted the colors, then everything slowly turned gray, and then finally shifted to black except for the fire glow. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight on, reading a little and listening to the faint movement of the stream. The sound almost blended with the wind in a calming way. I eventually felt tired and lay down. The cold air made the inside of the sleeping bag feel even warmer. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet forest. For the first hour or so, I drifted in and out of light sleep. I could hear small natural sounds outside, twigs snapping from small animals, leaves shifting, the slow water. Everything sounded normal. But then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly, not because of a sound, but because something felt different in the air. The atmosphere around my tent seemed heavier, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. The air felt colder than before, and the silence was strangely deep. It wasn't the normal forest quiet. It was a type of silence that felt controlled or forced. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to figure out why I felt uneasy. I listened carefully. First, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, I heard something that didn't belong to the natural sound of the forest. It was a soft metal clicking noise. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to stand out. The rhythm of it didn't match anything natural. It sounded like metal tapping metal or something shifting inside a bag of tools. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag and walked to the tent door. I didn't open it right away. I pressed my ear against the fabric and listened again. The metal sound appeared once more, but this time it was followed by a low, muffled thud, almost like someone placing something heavy on the ground. The sound came from the direction behind the tree line near the stream. It didn't sound close enough to be right outside my tent, but it wasn't far either. My pulse picked up. I tried to tell myself it could be anything, maybe a deer knocking something over or branches rubbing together, but I knew it wasn't. The sound was too controlled, too deliberate. A few seconds later, I heard another noise, a soft crunch, like someone stepping slowly on leaves while trying not to make much sound. I froze completely. My entire body stayed still as I breathed slowly and quietly. Another step, then another. Someone was out there, not an animal, person. I slowly turned off my flashlight. My tent became darker, and the faint fire outside had burned almost completely down to glowing orange pieces. My heartbeat felt so loud inside my head that I was scared it would give away my position. I crouched lower and listened. The steps were slow, spaced apart, and almost like the person was scanning the area or searching for something. At one point, the footsteps stopped altogether. I waited for what felt like a very long time. The silence returned, but this time it felt tense, not peaceful. After a few minutes, I decided to peek outside. I opened the tent zipper just an inch, slow enough that the sound was barely audible. Through the small gap, I looked toward the trees. First, I saw nothing. just black shapes of trees and faint light from the dying fire. Then I saw a darker shape moving between the trees. A tall figure. The shape paused and seemed to look around, though I couldn't see a face. It was too dark. I couldn't tell if the person was carrying something, but their silhouette looked bulky around the upper body. I felt a deep fear grow inside me. I didn't know who it was, why they were there, or what they were doing near my camp at such a late hour. The area was remote. No trails led directly to that valley. Most people wouldn't even know it existed unless they had a specific reason to go there. The figure moved again, slowly stepping out of my view behind a tree. I waited. After several seconds, I heard the metal clicking sound again, much clearer this time. It sounded like someone adjusting a piece of equipment or opening something. I pulled my head back inside the tent and sat quietly. I tried to think of what to do. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to run blindly into the forest at night. But I also didn't want to sit there waiting for the person to discover me. I reached for my backpack slowly, feeling the fabric with my fingertips so I wouldn't create noise. I grabbed my small knife, not as a weapon but for comfort. I knew it wouldn't protect me from anyone who meant harm, but holding it made me feel less helpless. I sat in silence for a long time, maybe 20 minutes or more. The footsteps didn't return. The metal noises faded. Eventually, the forest fell silent again. But the fear didn't leave me. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep in short bursts, waking up every few minutes. I didn't know exactly when the night ended, but I noticed the tent fabric lightening gradually. The morning light crawled slowly into the forest and softened the darkness outside. When it was bright enough to see shadows clearly, I stepped out of the tent carefully. The cold morning air touched my skin, and I scanned the area slowly. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints I could clearly see. No signs of someone walking around. Nothing that screamed danger. The forest looked the same as the day before. But I knew something had been there. I couldn't explain it away. I walked toward the trees where I saw the shadow. I moved carefully, checking the ground. After a little searching, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Near the base of a tree, half covered by leaves, I found a small metal hook. It looked like something used for trapping animals or hanging equipment. It was old, but still strong. It didn't look like it had fallen naturally. It looked like it had dropped from someone's pack recently. Then I noticed something else. Further ahead, deeper in the trees, I found a set of tracks. Not clear footprints, but disturbed ground that showed movement. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy or carried weight in the night. I followed the disturbed earth slowly until it led me to something more concerning. About 30 meters from my camp, hidden behind thick bushes, I found a small area of flattened ground. On top of it lay a piece of dark cloth and two metal wires shaped like parts of an animal snare. The wires looked new, replaced recently. The cloth seemed like it was used to wrap equipment. Everything about that spot suggested someone had been setting up traps or gear, maybe even preparing to catch something illegally. It was then I realized I could have walked straight into someone's illegal hunting or poaching zone without knowing it. If that was true, then the person walking around my camp last night wasn't just a harmless hiker. They could have been checking traps or carrying out some hidden activity they didn't want anyone to see. And the last thing such a person would want is a witness sleeping nearby. A strong sense of danger washed over me. I didn't pack my gear slowly. I packed fast, forcing everything into my backpack without caring about organization. Every minute I stayed there felt too long. I kicked dirt over the fire remains and didn't look back. I started the hike out immediately. The forest looked normal, but I felt watched the entire time. Every sound made me turn my head. At one point, I thought I heard someone matching my pace far behind me. But when I stopped, the sound stopped too. I didn't see anyone. Hours passed. My legs hurt from walking fast without breaks. I didn't drink until my throat felt dry. I just wanted to get out of that forest as soon as possible. When I finally saw the first sign of the main trail, I felt a wave of relief. But I didn't slow down. I walked all the way back to my car, unlocked it quickly, and sat inside with the doors locked until my breathing steadied. Before leaving the area, I looked back at the forest one last time. The sky had cleared, and the sun was hitting the trees gently. The place looked peaceful and harmless, nothing like what I felt during the night. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw, and the items I found near my camp were real. When I got home, I thought about whether I should contact someone about the traps. I knew illegal poaching was a serious issue in remote forests, but I also knew that I had no exact coordinates of the items, and I wasn't sure if going back there was a good idea. The thought of returning made my chest tighten with fear. In the end, I reported what I experienced to the local ranger station. I told them the area I camped in and what I found. The wires, the metal hook, the flattened ground, the noises at night. The ranger listened seriously and said they would check the area. They asked if I could point it out, but I said I didn't feel safe going back, especially if someone was out there at night walking around with equipment. The ranger told me I did the right thing. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the shadowy figure moving between the trees, searching slowly, checking things, possibly seeing the light of my fire and walking closer to inspect who had entered their hidden spot. I kept thinking about how quiet the person had been and how easily they could have gotten closer without me noticing. I realized how vulnerable I had been out there alone. I had chosen the most remote spot. I had walked deep enough that no other camper would hear me if something happened. The person out there had the advantage. They knew the area and they were carrying metal tools. I had only a small knife and a thin tent wall separating me from whatever intentions they had. The part that stays with me the most is the silence before the footsteps. The way the air felt heavy, as if the forest itself knew someone dangerous was moving through it. I still go camping, but never alone in places that deep anymore. I stay closer to known trails. I choose areas where people pass from time to time. I check for any sign of traps or unnatural activity before setting up camp. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in my sleeping bag, I remember that dark shape near the trees and wonder how close they came to my tent while I slept. I wonder if they stood there for a moment watching, deciding whether I was a problem for them. I wonder if the only reason I'm able to think about it now is because they chose not to come closer that night. I will never know their reason for being there, but I know for certain that I was not alone in those woods. And that thought still chills me more than anything else I've ever experienced. I went camping alone late in the season, when most people were already done with the mountains and the cold was starting to settle in for real. I liked this time of year because the trails were empty, and the forest felt calmer than usual. I drove my old car up a rough dirt road that twisted deeper into the woods than I usually went. The road was narrow and full of ruts, and I had to slow down again and again so the car didn't scrape its bottom. I remember looking at the clock on the dashboard and seeing it was getting close to evening, but I still felt calm. I had done this kind of trip before and I felt like I knew what I was doing. I kept telling myself that I just needed to reach the clearing I'd seen on the map, unpack my gear, get the tent up, and settle in before darkness came. When I reached the clearing, I stepped out and stretched my legs. The air was cold but clean in a way I liked, and it carried that smell of pine and wet soil. I stood there for a moment, hearing nothing but the faint rustling of branches high above me. The clearing wasn't wide, but it had enough room for a tent, a small fire, and space to move around without bumping into anything. I walked around to check the area the way I always did. The ground was covered in dry leaves, some patches of soft dirt, and a few scattered rocks that I kicked aside to make the spot cleaner. There were no footprints around my chosen space, no cut branches, no signs of another person. It felt untouched. I unpacked my tent and got to work. I laid the tarp down first, smoothing it with my hands, feeling the cold texture of the material under my palms. Then I set the tent poles and raised the tent slowly until it stood straight. I hammered the stakes into the ground with a small metal tool I kept in my backpack. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at it with a kind of quiet pride, like I had built something from nothing. I put my sleeping bag inside, arranged my backpack near the entrance, and placed my flashlight next to where my head would be. The daylight was fading faster than I expected, so I collected some fallen branches and small logs. I took my time picking the dry ones, tapping each with my knuckle to hear if it sounded hollow, because hollow usually meant dry. I built a small fire ring with rocks I found around the clearing and stacked the wood in the center in a tight little structure. When the fire started, I felt its warmth spreading slowly against the cold air. I sat beside it, eating a simple meal from a small metal pot I heated. As I ate, I watched the shadows around me grow deeper. The fire crackled softly, throwing sparks up into the darkening sky. When darkness finally settled across the clearing, everything around me changed. The trees became tall black shapes with no detail, and the sounds of the forest started to stand out more sharply than before. I heard twigs snapping at a distance, leaves shifting, branches swaying. None of it felt unusual. Forests are full of noises at night. Still, the isolation had a way of making each sound feel closer than it probably was. I stayed by the fire until the pot cooled off. My hands were stiff from the cold, so I warmed them near the flames before putting the fire out. I wanted to sleep early because I planned to hike deeper into the woods in the morning. I stepped inside the tent, zipped it up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I lay there on my back for a long moment, listening to the faint sounds of the night as the last glow of the fire faded completely. First, I felt calm. My sleeping bag was warm, and the ground under me was firm but not uncomfortable. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, breathing slow and steady. I could hear the trees moving in the wind, and I focused on that sound until everything seemed distant and soft. I began to drift into sleep. But then, just as I started to sink into that half-awake state, I heard something. It was soft at first, almost too light to recognize. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of the tent. The sound came again, a slow, dragging movement through the leaves outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a falling branch. It wasn't the light hopping of a small animal. It had weight to it, like something larger was moving low to the ground. I held my breath without meaning to. The sound grew more defined. Leaves shifting, dry twigs cracking, a faint thump and another soft drag. It seemed to circle the clearing at first, slow and steady, as if whatever it was exploring the border of the space I had claimed. I stayed completely still inside my sleeping bag. My heart started beating faster, and I felt each beat in my throat, so heavy it almost hurt. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or maybe a coyote. Animals pass by campsites all the time, but something didn't feel right. The movements were too slow, too careful, almost controlled. It wasn't wandering through, it was staying close. The sound moved again, this time directly behind my tent. I felt the faintest vibration under me, like something heavy had stepped close enough for the ground to react. I stared at the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the outside world. It felt impossibly thin at that moment. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't reach for my flashlight, afraid the noise or motion might draw attention. The thing outside stayed behind the tent for a long time. I could hear its breathing, a slow, steady pull of air that didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. It almost sounded like a person, but that idea made my skin crawl so badly that I pushed it away. I listened to the breathing and felt my chest tighten. My mind kept building images I didn't want to think about. Then it stepped closer. I felt the dirt shift under the weight, right behind my head. The breathing got louder. I couldn't understand how the thin walls of the tent still stood between me and whatever was just inches away. My fingers curled into the sleeping bag until my knuckles hurt. Sweat ran down my neck even though the air was cold. I waited. I listened. I kept counting my breaths in my mind to stay calm. After a long stretch of silence, I heard something new. It was a low scrape, like something being dragged slowly across the ground. Then a soft tap against the tent fabric. The tap was gentle, but it felt like a shock traveling through my body. The fabric moved slightly inward with the touch. My heart felt like it stopped. The scrape continued, moving around the tent. It was slow and smooth, like someone dragging a long object across the leaves, pausing now and then. I could feel the faintest vibrations each time the object bumped into the tent wall. I stayed frozen inside the sleeping bag, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe more. The sounds continued their slow path around the tent. Each movement made me feel more trapped. I wanted to unzip the sleeping bag and grab my flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to make noise. The fear held me down like a weight on my chest. Eventually, the scrape and the breathing faded. The sounds moved away, heading deeper into the trees. I waited until I heard nothing. Even then, I waited longer. My body felt stiff and tense, like it had locked itself in place. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until morning, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for the slightest sound. My body stayed alert even when nothing else happened. My mind replayed the movements outside again and again. When the sky finally started to lighten, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My legs shook slightly from exhaustion, and the cold air hit my face hard. The clearing looked exactly the same as when I arrived, but the ground around the tent told a different story. The leaves were pushed aside in a rough circle, and there were deep impressions where something heavy had moved. The impressions were too wide for a deer, too long for a coyote. I crouched down and touched one with my fingers. The soil was packed flat in a way that suggested real weight. I followed the disturbed leaves toward the edge of the clearing. They stopped near a tree at the far side. There was a patch of bark missing at about knee height, scraped away in a long, smooth line. I ran my hand over it. The wood was fresh and pale, like the bark had been stripped recently. I didn't like the feeling in my chest as I stood there. Something had stood near that tree in the dark. Something had scraped the bark away. Something had moved around my tent slowly for a long time. Whatever it was, it stayed close enough to touch the tent. And it had hands or something like hands, judging by the clean strip of bark. I packed my tent fast. I barely ate breakfast. I didn't stay to look around more. I wanted to leave the clearing as soon as possible. My hands shook the entire time I took the tent down. The air felt heavier now, like something was watching even though I didn't see anything. I walked to the car quickly, glancing back again and again. My steps felt too loud. When I reached the car, I opened the door and tossed everything into the back seat. I started the engine and turned around on the narrow dirt road, trying not to get stuck in the deep ruts. My tires slipped once, and my heart jumped so hard that it hurt, but I managed to get free. As I drove away, I noticed something on the side of the road, a single long mark in the dirt, like something had been dragged across it. It wasn't deep enough to be from a vehicle. It wasn't shaped like anything an animal would leave. It ran parallel to the road for several meters before disappearing into the trees. I kept driving. I didn't stop again until I was back on the main road. Even then, I didn't feel calm. My hands were still trembling. By the time I reached home, the sun was already high. I brought my camping gear inside and set it down in the living room. When I unrolled the tent to check if it was damaged, I saw a faint indentation along the side, a long, narrow line where something had pressed against the fabric during the night. I ran my hand along it and felt the dip under my fingertips. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that mark. I knew it wasn't from the stakes or the poles. It wasn't from anything I did. It was from something outside, something that came right up to me while I lay inside, pretending not to breathe. I threw the tent back into the pile of gear and stepped away from it. My chest felt tight again. My house was quiet, but I kept listening for sounds from outside, half expecting to hear the same slow dragging I heard in the forest. For days after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tent in the dark. I felt the soft tap against the fabric again. I heard the breathing inches away from me. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the thought never stayed long. Something about the sound, the movement, the weight, it didn't match anything I had ever experienced in the woods. Even now, when I think back to that night, what bothers me the most is not what it did, but what it didn't do. Could have ripped the tent, could have come inside, could have made noise or tried to scare me, but it didn't. It just circled me in silence, touched the tent once, scraped the ground with something long and smooth, and then stood behind me breathing slow and steady. Felt like it was studying me. That thought has stayed with me ever since. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. I always pick busy campgrounds now with people nearby. I keep a light on inside the tent at night. I keep my boots close so I can run if I have to. I haven't gone back to that clearing. I don't want to see it again. I don't want to find new marks on the ground or fresh strips of missing bark on the trees. I don't want to know if whatever was there that night still goes back to that spot, circling the empty space where my tent once stood. The forest is big. There are things out there that keep their distance, things that stay quiet and careful, things that do not want to be seen but want to see you. I learned that the hard way, and I know for certain now that the scariest things in the woods are real, but they don't need to be supernatural. They just need to be watching. I went out camping alone because I wanted to get away from people for a few days. I had been feeling tired of work, tired of noise, tired of looking at screens all day. I wanted to hear real wind instead of traffic and feel dirt under my shoes instead of tiled floors. So I drove out toward a forest area that I had visited once before with a friend. I remembered it being peaceful, quiet, and empty. That was exactly what I needed. The road leading to the forest was narrow and rough, with patches of gravel breaking away from the edges, making my tires slide a little if I didn't keep the steering straight. My hands felt tight on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the mirrors, although I knew no one was behind me. The sky was pale blue, almost white near the horizon, and the sun was bright but soft. The air looked clean, and every now and then, small insects hit the windshield and left tiny streaks on the glass. When I finally reached the small parking area near the trail entrance, I turned off the engine and listened. At first, the only thing I heard was the ticking sound of the engine cooling down. A minute later, that faded away, and the silence of the forest took over. There were no voices, no cars, no distant machines humming anywhere. Just the wind brushing through the trees, birds calling from different heights, and the faint shifting of leaves. I grabbed my backpack, which felt heavier than usual because I had packed extra food, extra water, and a few tools I normally didn't bring, like a small folding saw and extra stakes for the tent. I had the idea that I might stay 2 nights if everything felt right. The trail started wide, then slowly narrowed as I went deeper into the trees. The ground was mostly dirt with patches of old roots sticking out like small knots. Every step I took made a dry cracking sound as twigs snapped beneath my boots. The farther I went, the more the smell of soil and pine filled the air. I felt like I had stepped out of the world I lived in and into something slower and quieter. After hiking for about an hour, I reached the area I remembered. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees. With enough space for one tent and a small fire pit, I checked the ground for anything that could puncture the bottom of my tent, cleared away a few small sticks, and set up my camp. I staked the tent securely, placed my sleeping bag inside, and arranged my gear so I could find things quickly if I needed them at night. Once everything was in place, I sat on a fallen log and listened to the forest. The sound came in layers. The wind in the upper branches made a soft rushing noise, while the lower branches made a lighter, more broken pattern. Birds hopped around somewhere above me, shifting their weight from branch to branch. I heard something small running through the dry leaves, probably a squirrel or chipmunk. The air felt clean in my lungs. I could feel tension leaving my shoulders. The rest of the day passed quietly. I walked around the clearing, scouted a short distance out in different directions to get a sense of the area, and gathered enough dry wood for the night. When the sun began to lower, I made a small fire and sat close to it, warming my hands. The temperature dropped faster than I expected. The sky darkened slowly, first turning gold near the horizon, then orange, then a soft gray that faded into a deep blue. When night finally came, the forest turned almost black except for the area lit by the fire. At some point, I realized something strange. While sitting there, I felt like something was moving far off in the trees, something heavy enough to crack old branches under its weight. I kept still, listening hard. The sound came again, a slow, dragging crunch as if something was stepping in leaves. I told myself it was probably just a deer moving around. They were common in this area. But I also knew that deer usually moved in lighter steps, quicker steps, not slow, spaced out ones. These steps sounded firm, spaced widely apart, almost deliberate. But nothing came toward the camp, and after a few minutes the sound faded until I couldn't hear anything at all. The fire crackled loudly in the quiet. I kept listening, but the forest had gone still again. When the fire burned low, I covered it and made sure the embers were safe. Then I got into the tent, zipped it closed, and lay inside my sleeping bag. The air inside the tent had that typical nylon smell, mixed with the faint scent of the forest that had settled on my clothes. The floor felt even, and the rustling of the tent fabric shifted every time the wind moved. I lay still for a long time. It always takes me a while to fall asleep on the first night when I camp alone. My ears kept picking up every small noise outside. A stick snapping, leaves rustling, something brushing lightly against another thing. All of it sounded louder in the dark. My heartbeat seemed louder as well. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy, and I drifted off. I didn't sleep long before something woke me. It was faint at first, a sound that blended into my dream before it pulled me out of it. A slow, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving around my campsite. My eyes opened in the darkness of the tent. I held my breath without thinking. The sound came again, slightly clearer, then again moving around the clearing. I lay frozen, listening. The steps didn't sound like an animal running or pushing through brush. They were too steady, too careful. They circled the area, slow and spaced apart, like someone was walking around and checking each direction. My chest felt tight, and I could feel the warmth in my face from the tension rising inside me. My hands felt cold even though they were tucked inside the sleeping bag. I didn't move an inch. I didn't even swallow. I didn't want to make a sound. I kept listening. The steps stopped for a few seconds, then came again from a slightly different angle, as if whoever or whatever it was had changed direction. My mind tangled through possibilities. A deer? No. A bear? Maybe. But bears usually moved differently, heavier and less careful. And bears didn't walk slowly around a tent in perfect circles. The steps continued for several minutes. Then everything went silent. I waited. I didn't move. I lay there until my muscles hurt from staying stiff. When the silence stretched too long to ignore, I slowly relaxed my body and let myself breathe normally again. My throat felt dry. My tongue felt stuck. I knew I wouldn't sleep again, but I stayed in the sleeping bag anyway because getting up in the darkness felt worse. I waited there until the sky finally started to lighten. The faint early morning light filtered through the tent walls, turning the darkness into a washed-out gray. When I felt certain the sun was rising, I slowly opened the tent zipper and stepped out into the cold morning air. The clearing was the same as before. The trees stood still. The air smelled crisp and fresh. Then I looked down. There were footprints around the tent. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Bare human footprints. They circled the tent in a wide loop at least 3 or 4 times. They were spaced evenly, as if someone had walked slowly and carefully. The prints were deep enough to show that the person had put weight into each step. The toes were clearly visible in the dirt and dried leaves, and the size looked like an adult's foot, longer than mine. The hair on my arms stood up. I felt a hollow pressure in my stomach, the kind you feel when something drops suddenly inside you. I scanned the trees, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing. Everything looked normal, too normal. I crouched down and studied the prints more closely. The ground was soft enough to capture good detail, and I could see the slightly uneven shape of the left foot's arch. Whoever it was must have been walking slowly because the prints were spaced apart at regular distances. They had encircled my tent over and over while I slept inside, unaware. I stood up and looked around again, turning slowly, scanning every gap between the trees. The morning light made long shadows stretch across the ground, and every shadow looked like something crouched or waiting. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I wanted to pack my gear and leave right then, but the thought of turning my back to the trees made my skin crawl. I forced myself to act calmly. I went inside the tent, grabbed my backpack, and began packing everything as fast as I could without making too much noise. As I packed, I kept thinking about what time the steps might have happened. I remembered waking up when it sounded like something was walking near the tent. That must have been it. Someone was walking in circles around me in the middle of the night. No light, no talking, no signs of anything being taken. Just slow footsteps circling me. After everything was packed, I put out the fire pit completely and began the hike back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps. The trail felt darker than the day before, even though it was morning. Every sound seemed like it was coming from something close behind me. Dry twigs snapped somewhere off to the side, but I couldn't tell if it was just a small animal. My pulse was loud in my ears, steady and fast. As I walked, I noticed something unusual on the trail. At first I thought it was animal tracks, but the shape was wrong. I crouched down and looked carefully. They were more bare human footprints. Not many, just 2 or 3 slightly off the trail, heading in the same direction I was going. My body went cold all over. Someone else had walked this way. Someone barefoot in the forest. Someone who circled my tent at night. I didn't follow the prints. I didn't want to know where they went. I kept moving, picking up my pace. My backpack bounced lightly against my shoulders, and my breath came quicker than it should have for the amount of effort I was using. The deeper I moved through the trees, the stronger the feeling got that I wasn't alone. It felt like someone was matching my pace but staying just far enough behind me that I couldn't see them. I kept stopping and turning around, but the trail always looked empty. The forest always looked still. The only thing that didn't feel still was me. Eventually, after what felt like too long, I reached the parking area. My car was the only one there, just like when I arrived. I scanned the area one last time before unlocking the door and getting inside. The quiet of the car felt strange after hearing nothing but forest sounds for 2 days. Before starting the engine, I sat there for a moment and looked out at the tree line. The shadows between the trunks looked darker than they should at this hour, and for a short moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision. But when I turned my head, nothing was there, just still trees. I started the car, backed out, and drove away from the forest without looking back again. Only when I reached the highway did my breathing relax. I drove home without stopping. When I got back to my apartment, I unpacked slowly, trying to settle my mind. But the image of those footprints kept coming back. Bare feet, adult-sized, deep prints, perfect circles around my tent. That night, I sat on my couch longer than I planned, thinking about the whole trip. I kept replaying the sound of the steps moving around me. I kept imagining the shape of the person walking there in the dark. No flashlight, no shoes, no sound except the slow crushing of dried leaves. It bothered me that the person didn't try to steal anything. They didn't try to open the tent or disturb anything. They just circled me, over and over, like they were studying me, like they were trying to see how close they could get without waking me completely. And what bothered me more was that I never heard them leave. I only heard them walking, then silence. Whoever it was might have stayed near my camp the rest of the night, standing somewhere in the darkness where I couldn't see, watching me through the thin fabric of the tent, waiting for something, or just enjoying the idea of being close to someone sleeping and not knowing they were there. The footprints around the tent had all been the same size. One person, one pattern, one slow circle after another. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone worse. I understood then that the scariest things in the woods aren't animals or storms. It's the quiet, patient presence of someone who chooses to be there in the dark, walking without shoes, circling a stranger's tent just to see what it feels like. And the clearest part of the ending was this. I realized that I had never actually been alone out there, not even for a minute. I went out on that trip because my head felt heavy from everything in my life, and I wanted a place where the only noise would come from wind moving through trees, water hitting rocks, or birds drifting from one branch to another. I picked an old trail that I had always wanted to try but kept putting off. It wasn't too deep into the mountains, but it was empty enough that I could go for hours without seeing anyone. That kind of isolation always felt nice to me in the daytime. It felt like I could breathe in a different way out there, almost like the air itself had more space in it. I packed light, just enough food for 2 nights, a single-person tent, my sleeping bag, a small stove, and a knife that I always kept on the side of my bag. I had been camping alone many times before, but this time I had a strange feeling even before I reached the place where I planned to set up camp. It wasn't fear or anything supernatural. It just felt like the woods were holding something quiet inside them, something that didn't want to be disturbed. The trail was narrow and covered in dry leaves that cracked under every step I took. I watched the sunlight break through the tree canopy in thin, sharp lines, almost like the forest was made of layers. Every time I looked up, I saw tiny pieces of dust floating in the still air, drifting slowly as if nothing in this place moved fast. A few hours into the hike, I noticed that the ground dipped slightly and the trees grew denser. The deeper I went, the more I felt the temperature drop. The air got colder in a strange sudden way, like stepping into a different pocket of the woods. I kept moving until I reached a small flat area beside a slow stream that was barely moving. The water was shallow and clear, running over a bed of small stones. I could hear it gently brushing against the rocks, and the sound was soft enough that it made the place feel peaceful. I thought it would be perfect to set up there. I put down my pack, stretched my shoulders, and looked around to make sure I had a good view in every direction. The trees formed a loose horseshoe shape around the clearing, and the stream ran along the open side. I liked that because I always wanted to see anything walking toward my camp. I didn't like feeling boxed in. Setting up my tent took only a few minutes. The ground there was firm and the soil was easy to work with. I hammered the stakes in with a flat rock I found near the water. The sun was already moving toward the far side of the sky, and the shadows were stretching longer across the clearing. When I was done, I sat on a log that had fallen years ago and listened to the woods. I could hear small things moving in the bushes, probably squirrels or birds landing on branches. Everything sounded normal, but something in the air felt heavier than it should have. After eating a simple meal, I walked around the area for a while just to get familiar with it. I liked knowing the shape of the land around my campsite so that nothing surprised me later. The terrain behind my tent rose up into a hill with thick undergrowth. It didn't look like a place anyone would want to climb without a reason. The trees leaned in slightly there, making it darker even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. When I walked toward the stream, I saw footprints in the mud. At first, I assumed they were mine, but they were deeper than mine and faced in the opposite direction. They looked fresh, maybe only hours old. They weren't animal prints. They were human. The size looked normal, maybe a bit smaller than my foot, and I couldn't tell if they belonged to a man or a woman. They went along the stream and then disappeared where the ground turned dry again. I stood there for a few seconds just looking at them. I didn't feel scared then, just curious. I knew I wasn't the only person who ever used this trail. People came through the woods all the time. But something about the direction of the prints bothered me. They were facing toward the exact clearing where I had set up camp. It made me wonder if someone had been here earlier today, maybe watching the same clearing I had just chosen. I pushed the thought aside and kept exploring, but I didn't go too far. The light was fading fast, and I wanted to gather some wood before it got dark. By the time the sky turned deep orange, I had a decent pile of branches and dry sticks to use for a small fire. I didn't want anything too big because large fires drew attention, and I liked keeping things quiet. I lit it easily since the wood was dry, and the flames climbed up slowly, making small crackling noises. I sat near it and watched the shadows move across the trees. The warmth felt nice on my face, and the smoke drifted upward in a loose twist. I could smell the wood burning, and it mixed with the smell of damp earth. I kept my knife close beside me, not because I felt threatened, but because it was a habit. As the last light died behind the trees, the forest changed. In the day, it felt open and easy to read, but at night, everything blurred together. The edges of things got softer. Shapes lost their outlines. I could hear more sounds now. Twigs snapping deeper inside the woods, leaves rustling even when there was no wind, small splashes from the stream. I kept my eyes moving steadily across the clearing. I knew the forest wasn't dangerous in a supernatural way, but a human could be worse than any animal out here. Hours passed. The fire died down into glowing red pieces, and I felt tired enough to crawl into my tent. The night air was colder, and my breath came out in faint white clouds. I zipped the tent closed, slid into my sleeping bag, and listened to the woods outside. For a long time, everything sounded normal. The stream kept its slow rhythm, and insects buzzed now and then. I felt myself drifting toward sleep. Then I heard something that pulled me awake completely. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was the slow, steady sound of footsteps on dry leaves, human footsteps, not the light tapping of an animal. They were coming from the direction of the hill behind my tent. I froze inside my sleeping bag and tried not to make a sound. The steps were slow and careful, almost like someone was trying not to be heard. They stopped, and then the woods were quiet again. I didn't breathe for several seconds. I kept waiting for the steps to continue or for something else to happen. Nothing did. Slowly, my heart stopped pounding as hard, and I told myself it might have been an animal after all. Maybe a deer, maybe something else walking through the woods. I forced myself to lie still and tried to sleep again. Around an hour later, I must have drifted off. I woke up to another sound. It was closer this time, so close that it felt like it was only a few feet away from the tent. It was the sound of something brushing lightly against the fabric. Not quickly, but slowly, almost like a hand dragging across the material. My chest tightened instantly, and every muscle in my body locked up. I kept my eyes open even though it was pitch black in the tent. The movement circled around me, first on one side, then the other. I could hear dry leaves shifting under someone's shoes. The steps were slow and cautious, and the person stayed just outside the thin wall of my tent. I felt so exposed lying there. A tiny sheet of fabric was the only thing between me and whoever stood there. After a few seconds, the movement stopped. Complete silence. I waited. I didn't make a single sound. Sweat slowly ran down the side of my face even though the air was freezing. I reached for my knife and held it tight under my sleeping bag. I wanted to unzip the tent and jump out, but I knew I couldn't see anything in that darkness. Whoever was out there was standing still. I could feel their presence, not in a supernatural way, but in the physical pressure of knowing someone was only inches away. I don't know how long the person stayed. It felt like hours, but after some time, I heard the steps move away from the tent. They were still slow, still careful. They faded toward the trees, and I waited until they completely disappeared. I stayed awake until the sky turned faint gray behind the trees. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and leave, but I also didn't want to panic. I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The cold morning air hit my face, and I looked around the clearing. Everything looked untouched at first, but then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints circling the tent in a slow loop. They were deep, deeper than the earlier ones I saw near the stream. They were from the same shoes, the same size. They stopped directly behind my tent and then continued to the edge of the trees. Whoever it was had stood there watching me at some point in the night. I felt something cold slide down the inside of my chest. I wasn't imagining anything. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my camp in the dark. Not an animal. Person. I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just broke down the tent and stuffed everything into my backpack. I kept looking over my shoulder every minute, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The woods were completely silent. Not a single bird called. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I started the hike back down the trail. My legs moved faster than usual, and every few minutes I stopped and listened. At first I didn't hear anything strange, but after about an hour of hiking, I heard leaves rustling behind me. When I turned, the trail was empty, but the sound came again later. Same direction, same slow pace. I kept hiking. At one point, I saw something on the side of the trail. A small piece of cloth stuck on a broken branch. I didn't touch it, but I recognized the color. It matched the faded brown jacket I had seen on the trail months earlier, worn by a stranger who passed me during another solo trip. I didn't know if it was connected, but seeing it now, after everything that happened last night, made my skin crawl. The rest of the hike became a blur of sharp breaths and constant checking behind me. The sound of footsteps behind me would come and go, always at the same distance. Always slow, always steady. If I stopped, they stopped. If I walked, they followed. Not close enough to be seen, but close enough for me to feel the weight of being watched the entire time. When I finally reached the small dirt road near the entrance of the trail, the footsteps stopped completely. The woods went silent again, the same way they had gone silent when I first sensed someone outside my tent. I walked the last mile to where my car was parked, and even though I tried to act normal, I kept turning around every few seconds. Nothing moved behind me. No one came out of the trees. The air felt open again, almost too open. I unlocked my car and threw my gear inside without organizing anything. My hands shook while I fumbled with the keys. When I finally started the engine, the sound was so loud compared to the quiet woods that it startled me. I drove off without looking back at the trail entrance. Only when I reached the main road did I feel my breath loosen in my chest. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't know what to say. There were no signs of violence, no proof, only footprints and the quiet, steady movements of someone who spent half the night walking around my tent and the entire morning following me down the trail at a distance. I stopped camping alone for a long time after that. Even now, whenever I walk in the woods, even in crowded places, I can't shake the memory of that slow circle of footsteps in the dark, only inches from where I slept. I still think about the person who stood there watching me with no intention of talking, no intention of revealing themselves, just observing me in silence through the thin walls of the tent. And the part that stays with me the most, the part that gives the story its ending, came a week later when I finally unpacked my backpack in my living room. When I took out the sleeping bag, a small, perfectly shaped footprint made of dried mud was pressed onto the bottom of the tent's outer fabric. A footprint that hadn't been there when I packed up in the morning. A footprint facing inward, toward the spot where my head had been during the night. It meant the person didn't just circle the tent. They had approached even closer after I fell asleep. Close enough to touch the tent. Close enough to lean down and press their foot against it. Close enough to stand directly over me while I slept. And that was the moment I understood clearly and fully. Whatever they wanted, whatever kept them circling the tent in the dark and following me through the woods, wasn't stopped by the sunrise. It only stopped because I left. If I had stayed one more night, I believe with complete certainty that the story would not end with me sitting safely at home remembering it. It would end somewhere in those woods, where no one would ever hear my footsteps again. I went camping alone in late October because I wanted some quiet time away from everything. My job, the noise in the city, the problems I didn't want to think about anymore. The weather was turning cold, but I liked it that way. The air felt cleaner when the temperature dropped, and the forests near the mountain range stayed quiet during that season. People usually waited for late spring or summer to go there. That meant the long trails, empty fire pits, and the little creek running through the lower valley would all be mine for days. I chose a place far off the marked path, a flat patch of dirt surrounded by tall pine trees. I found it early in the morning after hiking for hours. The ground was packed and dry. The trees stood close together around me like dark walls, and the forest floor was covered in dead brown needles that made a soft sound under my boots. Nothing seemed strange at first. The whole forest had that heavy, still feeling, like everything was holding its breath. But I liked that about camping alone. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered a big pile of firewood. I wasn't planning to go anywhere once the sun went down. The area had mountain lions and sometimes black bears, and I knew enough to stay put at night. After lunch, I walked around to learn the area. I found an old hunting blind made out of tree limbs and dark green tarp. The tarp was torn in the middle like something sharp had ripped it open. There were empty rifle shell casings scattered in the dirt near it. I picked one up and rolled it between my fingers, wondering how long it had been there. The metal was dull and cold. I kept exploring and found a strange trail a little farther past the blind. It wasn't a normal game trail. It looked like a single person had walked through the undergrowth over and over, forcing a narrow path between the trees. The ground was uneven, and the small plants along the sides were bent and broken. Whatever it wasn't made by an animal. It was too narrow and too straight, like someone had been pacing back and forth or walking the same route night after night. At first, I thought it might just be a hunter's path from last season. Maybe someone had used this area more than once and that was all. But the forest felt strangely empty around it. No birds, no squirrels, no sound of insects, Even the breeze high in the branches felt weaker. I followed the little path for maybe 15 minutes until it opened into a small clearing. The clearing had a rotten log lying across one side like a low bench. In the dirt near the log, I found a pile of bones. At first I thought it was just an old deer skeleton. A lot of hunters cleaned their kills right in the woods. But when I kneeled down to look closer, I realized the bones were mixed. Deer bones, yes, but also something else. Some of them were way too small for a deer, but too large for a rabbit. They looked like pieces of a human arm and hand. I felt my stomach tighten. I stayed there a long time, crouched, staring at the strange pile. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. They had dirt stuck to them, and a few were cracked open down the middle like something had gnawed at the marrow. The longer I looked, the more it felt like someone had been sitting on that log for a very long time with nothing but the bones for company. By the time I went back to my camp, the sun was already dropping behind the tree line. The forest grew darker quickly because the trees were so tall and thick. The temperature dropped too. I built up the fire until the flames were strong enough to push the shadows back. As I sat near the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about the bones. I tried to convince myself they were animal bones mixed with something else. Maybe a hunter had a dog and the dog died out there years ago. Maybe someone dumped trash in the woods. I gave myself every possible normal reason, but none of them felt right. And that strange narrow trail looked like someone had walked it again and again. Maybe pacing, maybe waiting. The forest stayed silent that night. Too silent. Usually, even in cold weather, you hear owls or branches snapping from small animals moving around, or the flutter of wings overhead. But there was nothing, not even the far-off howl of a coyote. Around midnight, while I was sitting wrapped in a heavy jacket, staring at the fire, I heard something far away. It was a dull, heavy sound. Not a footstep, more like something dropping onto the forest floor. A single thud, then silence. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening. But the sound didn't come again. The forest went back to that unnatural quiet, like something large was moving slowly but making no noise. I threw more wood onto the fire and stayed awake until my eyes burned. When I finally crawled inside the tent and zipped it shut, the air felt thin and cold. I lay there on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, trying not to think about anything. I kept telling myself the sound was a branch falling, or maybe a pine cone hitting the ground. But the weight of that sound felt wrong. It felt heavier, like something bigger than a man had dropped down onto both feet at once. I slept lightly, waking up at every small sound. At one point, I thought I heard slow breathing outside the tent. Not close, but not far either. It sounded steady, controlled, like someone trying to breathe quietly. I held my own breath until my chest hurt. When I finally exhaled, the breathing sound outside stopped completely. By morning, the air was foggy, and the trees looked ghostly behind the white haze. My fire had burned down to black ash. I stepped outside the tent and didn't see any tracks around my camp, but the fog made it hard to see more than a few meters in any direction. I felt like something was watching me through that fog. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to walk back to the hunting blind again, just to see it in daylight. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that the torn tarp had fresh rips along the bottom. The new rips were clean and sharp, like something strong had sliced through the fabric during the night. The shell casings in the dirt were scattered in a different pattern too, like someone had kicked them aside. I crouched near them and saw fresh mud on one of the casings. Not old mud, wet mud. My hands shook even though the air was cold. I scanned the forest around me. Everything was quiet again. Too quiet. Something wasn't right with that place. I went back to my camp and packed up some gear so I could explore farther. I didn't want to leave yet because I didn't want to feel like the forest was chasing me away. I convinced myself I was overreacting. People hiked and hunted here all the time. There was nothing supernatural about the woods. Everything had a real explanation. I followed a different path going deeper into the forest. The ground sloped downward, and the soil grew darker. The fog was slowly lifting. After a long while, I saw movement on the ground, boot prints. Fresh ones. They were deep in the dirt, pointing down the trail. Whatever made them was heavy, maybe wearing a full pack. I followed the footprints for a long time. They stayed straight until they suddenly veered off into the trees. I followed them off trail and found something leaning against a fallen log. A backpack. I walked closer and realized the straps were torn, like someone had yanked it violently off the owner. The fabric was muddy and covered with dry leaves. I lifted it and felt how heavy it was. Inside there were canned foods, a metal cup, a lighter, and a rolled map. But there was also a hunting license with a name on it and a small photo. The date on the license was from last year. I looked around the area. There were drag marks in the leaves. Long ones, deep ones, as if someone had been dragged downhill by the arms or legs. The marks were wide and rough, and every few feet there were places where the dirt was disturbed, as if the person had tried to dig their hands or heels into the ground to stop themselves. The drag marks led toward a darker patch of forest where the trees stood so close together that almost no light passed between them. I followed the trail slowly, step by step. My breathing felt loud in my ears. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. The drag marks suddenly stopped near the base of a hollow tree stump. The stump had a dark opening wide enough for someone to crawl into. Inside the stump, I found a shredded piece of a shirt sleeve and a broken flashlight. I stepped back. The forest felt too still. Every instinct in my body told me not to stay near that stump. I turned to leave. As soon as I stepped away, I heard a single heavy footstep farther behind me. Or at least it sounded like one. A deep, slow, heavy step. Then another. Not fast. Not rushing. Just slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was didn't care that I heard it. I didn't run. Running felt like it would trigger something. Instead, I walked quickly back toward my camp. The sound of those slow steps followed me for a long time, always the same distance behind me, like something was matching my pace. When I finally reached my camp, the steps stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring between the trees, but nothing moved. I made a decision right then. I needed to leave. I packed everything fast. I didn't even bother cleaning up the fire area. I only wanted to get back onto the main trail where the forest felt less heavy. As I started hiking out, I kept turning around to check behind me. The forest was completely still again. I moved fast, faster than I ever had during a hike. My legs burned, and my pack felt heavier with every step, but I didn't stop. Then I reached a point on the trail where the ground dipped and became swampy. The mud was thick. My boots sank into it with each step. I hated that part. I knew anything could leave tracks behind me, and anything could follow without making noise on that soft mud. At the edge of the swampy stretch, I saw a tree with deep scratch marks running down its trunk. They were fresh, cutting through the bark and into the pale wood underneath. I touched one of the scratches. The wood felt damp, like the tree had been damaged recently. As I looked at the marks, I heard another single, heavy step somewhere behind me. Not right on the trail, but off to the side. Slow, purposeful. My throat felt tight. I forced myself to keep walking. The trees around the swamp felt warped by the moisture. The air smelled sour. Every few steps I thought I heard breathing again. A slow inhale, then silence. Sometimes it felt like the breathing was to my left, sometimes to my right. I couldn't tell anymore if it was real or my mind trying to explain every soft sound the forest made. After what felt like an hour, the swamp ended, and the ground became solid again. The fog finally thinned enough that I could see the distant shapes of the mountains. My heart kept pounding, but I felt a small amount of relief. I walked until I reached the last ridge before the parking lot. From the top of that ridge, you can see the whole valley. When I turned back one last time to look at the forest behind me, I saw something far down the trail. Not a person, just a shape, tall, still, standing between the trees, watching me. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a tree trunk, or maybe a burned stump with a strange shape. But after a few seconds, the shape shifted its weight slightly, like a person adjusting their stance. I didn't wait to see anything else. I walked down the ridge fast until I reached the parking lot. I unlocked my car, threw my bag inside, and drove away without even taking off my boots. The whole drive home, I felt like something was behind me, Not following me on the road, but following me in my mind. I kept seeing the backpack, the drag marks, the torn tarp, the strange pacing trail, the bones near the log. I kept thinking about the missing hunter whose license I found. I kept thinking about that slow breathing outside my tent and the heavy steps that matched my pace. When I finally reached home, I sat in my driveway for a long time with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel. I realized something important right then. A clear, undeniable thought that locked itself deep in my mind. Whatever took that hunter was still out there. Whatever watched me from between those trees wanted me to know it had seen me. And whatever followed me through the forest stopped only because I left its territory. Asterisk, asterisk. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't see a monster. What I saw was something real, something human, something dangerous, something that knew the woods better than anyone else. And the most terrifying part was how quiet it moved, how patient it was, how it never rushed, how it waited in the fog, how it paced the same narrow trail over and over, wearing the ground down like someone trapped inside their own mind. I have never gone camping alone since then, and I never will again. I went camping alone deep in the northern part of a large forest reserve that spread for miles with thick pine trees, rocky hills, and long dirt trails that barely anyone used during the late season. It was already early autumn, and the air had started turning cooler, especially during the evenings. I had been working long hours and felt burnt out, and the idea of spending a few days in the quiet woods seemed like the best way to reset my mind. I planned the trip for weeks, checked the maps, checked the weather, packed enough food, water, and gear for 3 days, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The plan was simple: hike into an isolated area, set up camp near a small hidden lake I saw on the satellite map, stay there, relax, maybe fish a little, walk the trails, and just disconnect from everything. I wanted silence. I wanted distance from people. I wanted a break from the noise of everything I dealt with daily. What I didn't know was that going that deep into the forest attracted the kind of problems I never thought I would face in my life. I parked my car at a small empty dirt lot at the edge of the reserve. It was the kind of lot that wasn't even paved, with signs half buried in the ground, showing faded warnings about fire safety and keeping campsites clean. The place felt abandoned. It wasn't the main campsite area. It was just a spot where hunters or hikers sometimes left their vehicles. There was one old pickup truck parked at the far end with mud along the sides. It looked like it had been there a while. I didn't think too much about it. Hunters came out here all the time, and many of them liked staying in the woods for days. Once I strapped on my backpack and locked the car, I walked into the trail surrounded by tall pines and dry fallen leaves. The air smelled like sap and cold soil. The ground felt soft under my boots, and every step created a crunching sound that echoed faintly through the trees. There was no one else around. No distant voices, no engine sounds, just birds and the wind moving through branches. I liked that. I moved deeper into the forest with a steady pace. After hiking for hours, I finally reached the lake. It was small and round, surrounded by tall grass along the shoreline and thick pines on the outer ring. The water was still and dark, reflecting the grayish sky. No one else was there. No trash, no signs of people, just nature. I picked a flat area near the tree line where the ground felt steady enough for a tent. I set up camp, unpacked my gear, set the tent stakes, rolled out the sleeping bag, and placed my small food storage bag in a tree branch high above the ground to keep animals away. The whole process took some time, but once everything was done, I felt like I finally had a small home in the middle of nowhere. By late afternoon, the light started to dim slightly, and the chill grew stronger. I gathered some dry sticks from the ground, broke them down, and built a small fire. I heated a meal over the flames, listening to the crackling sound. There was something comforting about listening to the fire while looking at the still lake. I felt calm, but that calm didn't last long. While eating, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, on the far side near the trees, the bushes shook a little. At first, I assumed it was an animal. This area had deer, squirrels, rabbits, maybe even the occasional bear. But something about the movement didn't look like an animal moving through. Animals usually dart or hop or shift in quick motions. This movement was slow, controlled, almost like someone trying not to make noise. The bushes settled again, and nothing came out. I tried to ignore it. The woods always had movement. Maybe I was overthinking it. But deep inside, a small uneasy feeling grew in my chest. As the sun went down, the sky turned a dim blue and then almost black. The darkness moved quickly through the trees. I added more wood to the fire to keep it bright. The warmth felt good, and the orange glow helped push back the shadows circling the edge of my camp. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the lake, watching fog rise slowly from the cold water. I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself that the movement earlier meant nothing. Eventually, when the fire burned lower, I crawled inside the tent. I zipped it closed, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to rest, listening to the distant nighttime sounds. Hours passed with me lying there awake, shifting around, trying to get comfortable. Eventually, I dozed off. Sometime in the middle of the night, something woke me up. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound coming from outside. It wasn't an animal walking lightly. It was heavier, slow, measured, the sound of footsteps pressing into the ground. I held my breath, listening carefully. The sound stopped. Then it started again, this time further along the side of my tent. My heart began beating harder. My first thought was that it might be a bear, but the steps didn't sound like a four-legged creature. They came one at a time with clear pauses between each, almost like someone walking slowly around my campsite. I remained still inside the sleeping bag, afraid to move or make any sound. My ears focused on the outside. The steps moved again, this time toward the trees behind my tent. The sound faded gradually and then stopped completely. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I forced myself to stay awake for a long time, staring at the dark fabric of the tent. I didn't want to open the zipper and look outside. I didn't want to make any noise. I just waited, breathing slow and shallow. At some point, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. When morning came, the sky looked pale and the ground felt cold. I stepped out of the tent and checked around. The firewood pile was untouched. My bag hanging from the tree looked the same. Nothing seemed moved, but the ground had tracks. Human prints. Not mine. They were slightly larger. They came from the tree line, circled half of my camp, and led back into the woods. I felt a chill crawl up my back. Someone had been here during the night. Someone walking around my tent silently. Someone watching my camp in the dark. I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe it was the owner of the parked truck at the dirt lot. Maybe a hunter walking through. Maybe someone who camped far off and passed by. But why come so close? Why walk around my tent in the middle of the night? Why not call out? Why not move away when realizing someone was camping here? None of it made sense. But I didn't want to panic. I told myself that whoever it was, they were probably passing through and didn't want trouble. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to stay cautious. I would spend the day exploring but stay close to camp. I walked around the lake at one point, mostly to check if anyone else was camping on the other side. But there was nothing, just trees, bushes, and animal tracks. Around noon, I heard something distant, a faint metallic clinking sound coming from the direction opposite the trail I had come from. It echoed through the forest, but it was too far to identify. I froze and listened. Then it stopped. I felt the same uneasiness I had the night before, but I forced myself to continue my day. Throughout the afternoon, I thought about leaving early, but I didn't want to give up my trip because of a few strange sounds. I believed that daylight made things safe, but as the sun lowered again and the air turned cold, I felt more anxious. I gathered a big pile of extra firewood so I could keep a large fire burning through the night. I wanted light. I needed it. I cooked my food early, kept the fire going strong, and tried to calm myself as darkness crept into the forest again. When the sky turned black, the lake looked like a dark pit. Fog started forming again. The trees swayed gently, and every rustle in the bushes made me tense up. Hours passed without anything unusual happening. I thought maybe whoever came by last night had moved on to some other part of the forest. I tried to relax a little. Eventually, when the fire dimmed slightly, I added more wood and sat beside it, warming my hands. That was when I heard something again. A faint snapping sound came from deep in the woods behind my tent. Not a small twig. It sounded like someone stepping on a branch. I turned slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. I saw nothing, but the sound came again, a little closer. I felt my heartbeat speed up. I moved carefully to the other side of the fire, wanting the flames between me and the trees. I stared into the darkness, seeing only vague shapes. Then something appeared. It wasn't clear at first. Just a figure standing far back between two trees. Not moving, just standing there. I could barely see it, but I could make out the height. It looked like a person. Tall, still, watching. My mouth felt dry. My chest tightened. The figure didn't move closer. It just stood at the edge of the fire's reach, almost like it waited for something. I didn't know how long I stared at it. The fire crackled, the wind moved lightly, and the figure remained still. Then, slowly, it disappeared back into the trees. Not turning, not stumbling, just stepping backward into darkness until I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't know what to do. The fear in my chest felt heavy. I didn't want to run through the woods in the dark, risking getting lost or running straight into whoever it was. I forced myself to stay awake by the fire the entire night, adding wood whenever the flames dropped. My hands shook every time I heard distant noises. By morning, I had barely slept. My eyes felt sore, my head hurt, and my muscles felt weak. But the daylight brought a sense of safety again. I looked at the ground beyond the tree line and saw fresh footprints. Deep prints, the same size as the ones from yesterday. Someone had been standing there, watching me for a long time. I didn't care about the rest of my planned trip. I wanted to leave. I packed my tent quickly, grabbed my bag from the tree, and prepared to walk back to the car as fast as possible. The forest felt different now. Heavier, quiet in the wrong way. No bird sounds, no wind, just a strange stillness. I walked down the trail, constantly checking behind me. The path felt longer than before. Every distant sound made me turn my head quickly. I kept imagining footsteps behind me even when there were none. After an hour of fast walking, I finally reached a part of the trail with a small rocky clearing. As I stepped through it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. On the trail. Fresh ones. Heading in the same direction I was going. At first, I thought maybe they belonged to me from when I came here 2 days ago. But the dirt was too loose. These prints were new and deeper. Someone had walked toward the parking lot earlier that morning or late last night. I kept moving. My heart raced faster the closer I got to the car. The trail curved around a hillside and then dropped slightly. I pushed forward until I finally saw the faint outline of the dirt lot through the trees. Then I stopped. The old pickup truck that had been there when I arrived was still parked in the same spot. But now there was something else. A single fresh boot print right beside my car door. My throat tightened. My stomach felt cold. Somebody had walked right up to my car. Someone who didn't belong to me. I stepped forward carefully, scanning the woods around the lot. The trees were quiet. The air felt heavy. I reached the car, unlocked it quickly, and threw my backpack inside. Before getting in, I looked around the lot one more time. That was when I saw it. On the ground near the start of the trail, half hidden by dirt and leaves, something metal glinted faintly. I walked toward it slowly. When I reached it, I saw exactly what it was. A large metal hunting knife. Its blade was dull and scratched. The handle was cracked, but it wasn't old. It looked used, recently used. My stomach twisted. My skin crawled. Someone had dropped it. Maybe last night. Maybe early this morning. Maybe the person watching me from the trees. I backed away slowly, got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. I didn't look back at the forest. I didn't wait to think. I drove out of the dirt lot quickly, following the long, rough road back to the main highway. Even when I reached the paved road, the uneasiness didn't leave my chest. Every car behind me made me look into the mirror too many times. Every turn made me imagine someone following. When I finally got home, the fear stayed in my mind. I kept thinking about the figure standing in the trees, the footprints circling my camp, the knife by my car. It took me days to feel normal again. Even then, every night before sleep, I kept remembering that moment when I saw someone standing quietly in the dark, just far enough not to be fully seen, but close enough to know I wasn't alone. And the worst part was not knowing what they wanted. But the ending became clear to me days later, when something unexpected happened. 3 days after returning home, I checked the local news out of curiosity. I wanted to distract my mind, hoping to see something unrelated to my trip. Instead, I found something that made everything inside me freeze. Authorities had arrested a man in the same forest reserve. He was found hiding deep in the woods. He was armed, and he had been living out there for weeks. They mentioned reports of him stalking hikers, watching their camps, and moving around at night without making himself known. They found a collection of stolen camping items in his little hidden shelter, along with multiple weapons and disturbed notes. The man matched the description of someone seen near the area of the lot where I had parked. He had been reported earlier for suspicious behavior. He roamed the same trails I used. He hid in the same woods where I camped. And he was arrested only 1 day after I left. That meant something clear. Something that settled heavily in my stomach because now there was no question. The person watching my tent those nights, the figure standing in the dark behind the trees, the footsteps circling my camp when I slept, the knife left near my car. It was him. He had been following me, watching me, waiting for something, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep long enough, maybe waiting for me to walk away from camp, maybe waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't know exactly what he planned, but I knew enough to understand one simple, terrifying truth. Leaving early saved my life. I never went back to that forest again. I never camped alone again. And every time I think about that man standing silently in the trees, watching me from just beyond the firelight, I feel the same cold fear in my chest, reminding me how close I came to something far worse than I imagined. And the ending stays clear in my mind every time. I remember the day I decided to go camping like it was yesterday, even though months have passed. I had been working long hours at a dead-end job in the city, staring at screens, typing emails, and feeling a constant weight in my chest. I needed to escape, to find a place where I could just breathe, where the air was thick with pine and dirt instead of exhaust fumes and human noise. I packed my old, scratched-up backpack with all the essentials I could think of. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, a few granola bars, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I made sure to bring extra batteries and my old water filter, the one I had used a few years ago when I first went hiking in the mountains near my town. I wanted to go somewhere remote, where I wouldn't see a single person for miles, and I wanted to truly be alone. The drive to the trailhead was long and quiet. The sun was dipping low in the sky as I left the last town behind. The road twisted and turned through dense forests, the kind of thick green trees that almost blocked the light from above, making it feel like the forest itself was swallowing the road. My car windows were down, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the car. Birds were calling to each other, and somewhere in the distance I thought I heard a low growl, but I dismissed it as a dog or maybe even a coyote. I had been in the wild before and knew the sounds could easily be misinterpreted. When I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was nearly gone, leaving only a soft orange glow in the sky. The parking lot was empty except for a lone pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking down the trail. The trail was narrow and winding, covered with roots and loose stones. Every step I took made a crunching sound on the dried leaves that littered the path. I felt a thrill of excitement and nervousness at the same time. This was exactly what I had wanted. Isolation, the possibility of real danger, and the chance to test my own limits. As I walked deeper into the forest, the light faded faster than I expected. The tall trees blocked out almost all the remaining sunlight, and shadows stretched across the ground in ways that made the forest feel alive. I could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant murmur of a stream. I reminded myself to stay calm and focused, and to keep my bearings. I had a map and a compass, and I had studied the area for weeks before deciding on this spot. I wasn't lost yet, but I could feel the change in the forest's mood as the sun sank completely below the horizon. I set up my camp near a small clearing by a river. The river was quiet but strong, the water moving over smooth rocks and making a soft, constant sound that was oddly comforting. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure to stake it firmly in the uneven ground. I built a small fire in a stone ring I found nearby, careful to keep it controlled and safe. The first night was peaceful, the kind of peace that fills you with a strange sense of both safety and vulnerability at the same time. I cooked a simple meal, eating canned beans and a few slices of bread, and then lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The wind whistled softly through the trees, and I could hear distant animals moving around. I felt a thrill at being so completely alone. The second day, I decided to hike further into the forest, following a narrow path that the map indicated would lead to a small ridge with an excellent view. The hike was more difficult than I anticipated. The trail was steep, covered with loose rocks, and in some places completely overgrown with bushes and thorny branches that scratched my arms and legs. I had to move slowly, using my hands to balance myself and push through the foliage. By midday, I was sweaty and exhausted, but I kept moving, driven by the desire to reach the ridge and the sense of accomplishment that would come with it. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped to rest near a large rock formation. The forest was silent except for the occasional bird call and the distant gurgle of a stream. I took out my water bottle and drank slowly, scanning the trees around me. That's when I noticed the first signs that something was off. There were broken branches on the ground, snapped in a way that didn't look natural. The leaves were disturbed, and I could see footprints in the soft dirt, not far from where I was sitting. They were too large to be a deer, and the spacing suggested a human walking. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was probably another hiker. The trail was isolated, but not completely empty. I decided to move on quickly, keeping my eyes and ears open. The further I went, the more signs I saw, more footprints, broken branches, and even a few bits of trash that looked recent. It was impossible to tell if anyone was following me, but I felt a strange, creeping unease that made the hair on my arms stand up. I kept walking, trying not to panic, reminding myself that I was experienced in the outdoors and that I had survival skills. But still, the forest felt different now. The shadows seemed longer, darker, and more threatening. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made me tense. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was low, and the forest below was bathed in a golden glow. I stayed there for a while, taking in the view and trying to calm myself. The sight was breathtaking, but it did little to calm the tight knot of fear that had grown in my stomach. I decided to head back to my camp before dark. On the way down, the forest grew even darker, and I found myself stumbling over roots and rocks that I didn't notice in the daylight. The uneasy feeling didn't leave me. If anything, it intensified. I reached my camp just as the last light faded completely. I built my fire higher than usual, wanting both warmth and light. I cooked a simple dinner and sat close to the fire, listening intently to every sound. That night, sleep was impossible. Every snap, rustle, and whisper of wind made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move outside my tent. I froze, straining my eyes in the darkness. Could have been a deer, a bear, or just my imagination. I gripped my flashlight tightly, shining it around the clearing, and saw nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I packed my gear quickly, deciding to hike back to my car and end the trip. I didn't want to push my luck any further. As I moved through the forest, I noticed that the footprints I had seen the day before were gone. The forest seemed empty, almost serene again. I walked briskly, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the ridge. Around midday, I reached a narrow part of the trail that ran along a small cliff. The drop was steep, and the path was barely wide enough for one person. I was moving cautiously when I heard a low growl behind me. I froze. My heart pounded. Slowly, I turned my head. There was a large black bear, standing just beyond the trees, staring at me. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall on its hind legs, with shiny black fur and sharp claws. My mind went into overdrive. I knew enough about bears to know that running could trigger a chase. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on it, speaking softly, even though I knew it probably couldn't hear me. I reached for my bear spray, praying it would be enough. The bear growled again and stepped closer. I took a deep breath and aimed the spray, hoping to scare it off. The bear flinched, backing up slightly, giving me just enough time to carefully move past the cliff edge and onto a slightly wider part of the trail. The walk back felt endless. Every sound made me jump, and I kept my bear spray at the ready. I stayed alert, constantly scanning for movement, until finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the edge of the forest and the clearing where I had parked my car. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong that I almost collapsed. I reached the car, locked the doors, and sat inside for several minutes, catching my breath and letting the adrenaline subside. On the drive home, I thought about the experience and the lessons I had learned. I realized how important preparation, awareness, and respect for nature were. The forest was beautiful, but it was also unpredictable and dangerous. I had been lucky in many ways. Lucky that the bear didn't attack, lucky that I had the presence of mind to stay calm, and lucky that I had chosen a path that allowed me to retreat safely. Once home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned it carefully, and reflected on the trip. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and gratitude. I had faced real fear, been completely alone, and come through it safely. The experience stayed with me for weeks, a constant reminder of both the beauty and the danger of the wilderness. I never went back to that exact trail, but I continued to explore other areas, always more cautious, always more aware, and always prepared. The forest had shown me its raw, unforgiving nature, and I had survived it. That was a victory in itself. I drove out to a remote part of the national forest because I wanted a quiet weekend away from everything. I had been feeling tired and stressed for weeks. I thought a long walk in the woods would clear my head. I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some food, and the usual gear that I always kept in my trunk. The plan was simple: reach the forest before sunset, hike a few miles from the marked trail, find a flat area, set up camp, cook something warm, and sleep early. The sky looked calm when I left home, but clouds were already building up in the distance. I felt a little uneasy about that, but I told myself it was normal winter weather and kept driving. The forest road became worse the deeper I went. The gravel turned into mud in several places. Tall trees stood close on both sides, their branches heavy and dark. I kept driving until I reached a small open patch that looked wide enough to park the car without blocking the road. The air felt colder when I stepped out. The quiet surprised me. There was no sound of birds or wind, only a faint distant hum like the forest was holding its breath. I adjusted the straps on my backpack, locked the car, and started walking uphill where the trees were thinner. The trail I followed looked old. Stones were scattered across it, and dried brown leaves covered the ground in thick layers. After about an hour of walking, I reached a place that looked safe enough to camp. It had a few flat spots between the trees and a view of a long slope dropping into a valley. I placed my backpack on the ground and stood still for a moment, listening. The silence felt heavy, but not dangerous. Just empty. I chose a spot between 3 tall pines and set up my tent, making sure the stakes were deep enough in the ground. By the time the tent was done, the sky had darkened. The clouds had moved over the sun, turning everything into a dull gray color. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and ate slowly. The air smelled like wet soil and pine needles. I expected wind, but there was none. The forest was strangely still. I tried to relax, but a tense feeling kept building inside me, like something was watching me, even though I could not see anything around. As the light faded, I gathered some dry wood and prepared a small fire pit. But after checking the forest rules, I decided not to light a fire. The air was too dry, and the risk felt too high. Instead, I cleaned the area around the tent and double-checked all my supplies. I placed my food in a sealed bag and hung it on a thick branch a short distance away. I walked back to my tent slowly. My boots pressed deep into the wet ground, creating small prints. When I reached the tent, I unzipped the entrance, got inside, and zipped it again. I lay on my back, listening. The forest remained quiet for a long time. My heartbeat was the loudest thing I could hear inside the tent. I tried to distract myself by organizing my gear, placing items where I could reach them. The cold crept in, and I wrapped myself deeper in the sleeping bag. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I sensed was a faint crunching sound outside the tent. It was soft at first, slow, careful, like someone stepping lightly on dried leaves, trying not to make noise. I held my breath. The sound came again, this time a little closer. Then it stopped. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, listening. I had been camping many times before, and I knew how animals moved, how they sounded. This did not feel like an animal. The rhythm of the steps felt too controlled, too human. Minutes passed without any more noise. My chest felt tight. The cold air inside the tent felt even colder against my face. I slowly reached for my flashlight and held it in my hand. I didn't turn it on. I waited until my breathing calmed a little. When the forest stayed silent long enough, I finally managed to fall asleep again. I woke up to a thin blue light slipping through the tent fabric. Morning had come. I stepped outside and stretched, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night. The first thing I noticed was a footprint in the mud near my tent. A human footprint, not mine. I checked the size and shape. Definitely a boot print bigger than my own. It faced directly toward my tent. My stomach tightened. I looked around the area. Distance from the tent to the trees. The slope. Shadows. I kept scanning until I found more prints leading away from my camp and into a dense cluster of trees. The ground was soft, so the prints were clear. Someone had walked past my camp during the night. I followed the prints only for a short distance before stopping. Going further felt wrong. I returned to camp, grabbed my water bottle, and washed my face. The cold water stung my skin. I tried to push away the fear by telling myself it could have been another camper or maybe a hunter passing through at night. But I knew that hunters didn't wander so close to tents without making their presence known. I spent the rest of the morning collecting more wood, checking the area again, and trying to focus on normal tasks. Hours passed slowly. The sky stayed gray. The clouds looked heavier. The cold grew sharper. The forest remained unusually silent. I kept turning my head at every small sound. Even the breeze made me tense. By the afternoon, I decided to hike deeper into the woods to gather more water. The path I took led to a narrow stream about half a mile from my campsite. The stream ran quietly between the rocks, its water clear and cold. I crouched down, filled 2 bottles, and washed my hands in the water. When I stood up, I noticed something across the stream, a fresh boot print, pointing directly toward the water. Same size and shape as the one near my tent. I scanned the area. There were more prints leading deeper into the forest. Some prints were pressed deeper into the mud, like whoever made them was carrying weight or moving fast. I held my breath and listened. No birds, no movement, only the slow trickle of the stream. The prints were too close to my campsite for comfort. I walked back at a faster pace, turning my head often to check behind me. My heart wouldn't slow down. Every corner between the trees felt like a place someone could stand and watch me without being seen. When I returned, the sight of my tent gave me a small sense of safety, but only for a moment. I walked around the camp slowly, checking every sign on the ground. No new prints, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves. Everything looked the same as I had left it, but the air felt different, heavier, colder. As the evening came, fog started rolling in between the trees. It wasn't thick, but it was enough to blur the shapes of the trunks and the slope in the distance. The light faded earlier than I expected. I prepared my food quickly and ate without really tasting anything. I kept looking around, scanning the trees over and over again. My shoulders felt tense. My skin felt tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding nearby, watching. When the daylight faded entirely, the darkness swallowed the forest fast. I got inside my tent and zipped the entrance shut. My hands shook as I arranged my flashlight and kept it beside me again. I lay down, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every small sound outside made me tense. Then it came again. A slow crunch, then another, then silence. The steps were much closer this time. Too close. My heart pounded hard against my ribs. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, afraid to breathe too loudly. Something stopped right outside the tent. I could hear soft breathing through the thin fabric. Slow, deep, human, very close. I stayed frozen. I didn't move even a finger. I kept waiting, listening. The breathing stayed for a long time. Minutes felt like hours. Then the sound of slow steps moved away. Leaves shifted. A twig snapped. Then nothing. I stayed awake the entire night. My eyes stayed open even when they burned from dryness. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I didn't dare check the time. When morning finally came, I crawled out cautiously. My legs felt weak. The forest around me looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. I checked the ground. More boot prints surrounded my tent. Some were so close that the boot must have been inches from touching the tent fabric. I packed my gear immediately. My hands moved fast, even though they felt stiff from cold and fear. I checked everything twice and made sure I left nothing behind. I strapped the backpack on, tightened it, and started walking toward the direction I came from. Halfway down the slope, I saw something that made me stop. A used rifle cartridge on the ground. Fresh, shiny, lying beside a boot print facing downhill toward the direction of my car. Someone had been following my path, not randomly passing through, following me. The realization made my chest tighten sharply. My hands trembled. I kept moving, faster this time, not even stopping to adjust my pack. The forest felt different, not silent anymore, but tense. I heard faint rustling behind me several times, like someone stepping lightly, keeping the same pace as me but staying out of sight. The fog from the morning had thinned but still clung to the lower parts of the forest, creating patches of unclear vision. When I reached the area close to where my car was parked, I crouched behind a large fallen tree and scanned the surroundings. The car stood exactly where I had left it. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The road looked empty, but on the muddy ground near the driver's side door, there were more boot prints, deep ones, many of them. Whoever made them had been waiting there. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I kept scanning the trees, searching for any movement. My throat felt dry. My skin felt cold. I took a slow breath, then moved as quietly as I could toward the car. Every step felt like it took forever. When I reached the car door, I unlocked it with shaking hands, opened it, and got inside. I locked the doors instantly. My breath fogged the windows. I inserted the key, turned it, and forced myself not to panic as the engine started. I drove slowly at first, scanning the rearview mirror constantly. The trees blurred past. Every shadow felt like a person hiding. When I reached the main road, I finally let out a shaky breath. The forest looked smaller in the distance, but the fear stayed heavy in my chest. The uneasiness didn't leave even when I reached the town, even when I got home, even when I sat on my bed, trying to calm down. Later that evening, I realized something that made my stomach sink even more. The boot prints near my campsite had been fresh, very fresh, but the ones near my car were older, faded, slightly washed by earlier moisture. Whoever was watching me, whoever was walking around my tent at night, whoever left rifle cartridges and footprints deeper in the forest, they hadn't followed me back to the car. They had already been ahead of me, waiting, watching from the moment I arrived. I never went camping alone again, and I still check outside my window every night before I sleep.